Honourable members, the prayer. Lord, the God of righteousness and truth, grant to her Queen and to her government, to members of the Legislative Assembly, and to all in positions of responsibility, the guidance of your Spirit. May they never lead the province wrongly through love of power, desire to please, or unworthy ideas, but laying aside all private interest and prejudice, keep in mind their responsibility to seek to improve the condition of all. Please be seated.
Introduction of visitors, introduction of guests, ministerial statements, member statements.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
When I approach the federal building and I see the pride flag on the side of the building, I am proud. I'm proud to be part of a team that chose to celebrate pride for the whole month and not just a 24-hour photo op. That's why I was so honored to be able to join the community of St. Albert for the raising of their pride flag at City Hall. The Mayor of St. Albert noted that the flag would be up for more than 24 hours. I would encourage the members opposite to observe and follow this example next year. The Minister of Culture also joined the flag raising and told the crowd that pride should not be political. But Mr. Speaker, pride is and has always been political. The UCP politicized pride when they raised and lowered the flag at the legislature in under 24 hours, the same flag that flew for the entire month under our government. This government politicized pride when they became the first government in Canadian history to roll back gay rights. The Associate Minister of Natural Gas, whom I was glad to see attend, said it shouldn't be about bragging about who has a bigger flag. I agree. It's not about who has a bigger flag. It's about who flies the flag when the cameras aren't rolling and there are no crowds. I'm excited to know that when people come to the legislature, they see the pride flag. Flying the flag is important, Mr. Speaker, but taking real and meaningful actions are even more important. And this UCP is failing on both counts. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Calgary East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to celebrate Philippine Independence Day. Alberta is home to roughly 200,000 people of Filipino origin, and many of them today marks an important day in their history. On this day, 122 years ago, the Philippines became independent after hundreds of years of Spanish rule. We are lucky in Alberta to be home to so many wonderful people of Filipino origin and descent. Our people whose work ethic, community spirit, faithfulness are truly admirable. They have done so much to build the success and resilience of our province. Filipino immigrants bring to our province a rich heritage which is a strong thread in Alberta's ever-changing cultural fabric. Although we are home to a diverse collection of people, one commonality connects us all, an unshakable belief in the dignity and ability of our free individuals. The Filipino community truly embodies their ideal through hard work, sacrifice, and a strong sense of personal faith. The Filipino community in the province never cease working towards making our province a better place. Thank you to the thousands of people in Filipino community whose hard work, volunteering, charitable giving, faithfulness has made the province what it is today. The volunteerism of the community has been absolutely essential in the province as we combat the COVID-19 pandemic. Filipino organizations have been in the forefront of the effort to support our province's most vulnerable. I believe every member of this House can join me in extending a warm gratitude to the hard work of the Filipino community. May today be a joyful celebration of Philippine Independence Day for the many members of Filipino community across the province. Thank you and mabuhay.
Mr. Speaker, it's an honor for me to rise in the House today and speak to the new consultation process that I will be leading on behalf of the Ministry of Children's Services. The Child Care Licensing Act is due to expire in early 2021, and our government is committed to ensuring Albertans have their say in developing the new regulations and legislation. These consultations will provide us with important feedback on what high-quality childcare looks like to Albertans, with a focus on accessibility, affordability for those who need it most, and safety through regulations. Through suggestions for red tape reduction, we'll ensure that childcare operators can reduce overhead and spend less time on paperwork and more time with kids and families. Childcare operators and industry associations will be invited to participate in virtual table talk sessions throughout June, and an online survey will be available to all Albertans beginning next week. As a mother of 3, I know there's nothing more precious than our children. Most of my work was completed from home when my children were young, but I remember multiple times arranging for childcare at critical times in our business cycle, such as their fiscal year end. It was a lot of juggling and a tremendous decision to leave my little ones in the care of someone else. My primary concern as a mother has always been and will always be the safety and well-being of my children, as I know it is for any parent. So it's important for me to hear from both parents and providers to make childcare regulation in Alberta the strongest, to support families and ensure our children have opportunities to thrive in care. As a business owner, I know how frustrating it can be to come up against senseless redundancies and regulations which only serve to waste valuable time and resources. Time and resources, Mr. Speaker, which could have been dedicated to serving, in this case, our children and families. That is why, as we move into the legislative review, we are preparing by listening to the feedback from those who know the industry best, parents and providers. We want to make sure that the new legislation for this sector is informed by those who use it every day. I'm excited to start engaging with these key stakeholders and look forward to thoughtful review conducted with the well-being of Alberta's children at the centre. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lethbridge West.
David Knight-Legg, the Premier's so-called principal advisor, is in the news again, billing Albertans for even more luxury. Albertans might recall this particular crony for billing taxpayers over $45,000 worth of luxury travel to London. And now, it's more. $58,000 in luxury travel expenses in 6 months. This time, us Albertans, who have all seen our income tax and fees go up by over $1 billion in the UCP budget, are paying for Knight-Legg to stay in hotels with, quote, opulent bedding and marble bathrooms. Sure must be nice to be a sycophant of this Premier. Most Albertans could never afford this, and now as the Premier raises income tax on every Albertan while jacking up every single user fee that he can find, now there's definitely no way folks could afford what UCP insiders spend on booking themselves a Manhattan hotel with a marble bathroom. Outrageous. Nearly $60,000 spent on luxury travel for one political insider while 300,000 people lose their jobs. Folks are struggling to get by, wondering how they'll get through this recession while the UCP makes a bad situation worse. The Premier's been threatening what he calls a fiscal reckoning, using the recession he's made worse as an excuse to make life harder for all of us. But there's no reckoning for his friends or the partisan hacks he's taking all Canadians' tax dollars to pay for. You know, David Knight-Legg is well known in my constituency. He grew up in Lethbridge, but he is a long way from the Sandman Hotel on Mayor McGrath now, Mr. Speaker. This Premier needs to give taxpayers back the money his UCP took from us. David Knight-Legg needs to give taxpayers back at least a portion of these luxury expenses for trips Albertans haven't even seen an itinerary for. Was he undertaking any of his own private business on our dime? We don't know. We deserve better. So to the UCP and to DKL, give us our money back.
The honourable member for Lac St. Anne Parkland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week was Seniors Week, and I was impressed with the support our government showed for seniors. Alberta values its seniors greatly in my constituency, and my constituency is no exception. As seniors contribute so much to our communities. One of those individuals who contributed greatly to her community was Mrs. Flora Weiss. I had a chance to meet Mrs. Weiss and spend time with her at the home in Honourable Lodge. She was sharp as a tack, had a sparkle in her eyes, and always was a pleasure to be around. The word on the street was that you should never play cards for her with nickels or you would leave penniless. Even at the age of 103, she still cooked her own meals, taught the high school kids how to bake bread, and looked after the flower garden at the lodge, which they aptly called Flora's Garden. Flora was here in the House last year. I was going to read her statement as a token of honour, but unfortunately my statement wasn't read due to scheduling, and she passed away during day surgery later that fall before I could have her back. I'd like to take this time to honour Flora as I promised I would. Flora Weiss was the firstborn to Alex and Lena Kennedy on June 29, 1916, in a log cabin near Sangudo. Her parents were born and raised in Nova Scotia, but they quickly relocated to Edmonton for opportunity. The family went on to build the log cabin, which they called home for some time. In 1941, Flora married Frank Weiss, whose family was a half a mile from her. It was there that they raised and lived and had their 3 children. Flora and Frank were deeply involved in local organizations in the community, Historical Society, the Royal Purple, and the Elks, just to name a few. Shortly after Frank's death in 2010, Flora broke her leg on the farm and made a difficult decision to come live at the Chateau Lac St. Anne in Ottawa. While it was not necessarily where she wanted to be, she committed to having a positive attitude. Flora's positivity and the ability to tackle all of her life's challenges was a testament to her resourcefulness. When I asked her what her secret was to longevity was, Mr. Speaker, she said, simply, stay positive. Wow. Thank you to Flora and all of our seniors. You're truly the glue that holds us together.
Here, here.
The Honourable, the member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, 90 potential adoptive families were devastatingly sidelined by the news that their adoption agency, Adoptions by Choice, was suddenly closing. Having already invested tens of thousands of dollars into the process over the course of years, these families have lost that money and are now going to be at the back of the line at one of the 3 remaining adoption agencies in Alberta. While these agencies are independent contractors, they are licensed by the government. And under the adoptions regulation, the ministry is required to get annual financial statements and has the authority to investigate and revoke licenses. If Adoptions by Choice was in a precarious and unstable financial situation, the ministry should have been aware and perhaps could have done something about it. The minister has publicly committed to following up with the remaining adoption agencies to ensure there's a smooth transition of files. But so far, these parents have heard nothing, and after years of waiting, will be pushed to the back of the line with another agency. Many of them have told me this is now the end of their adoption journey. They can't afford to start again with a new agency or go through the heartbreaking years of waiting once again. That is why I'm writing to the minister to get answers for what happened so we can learn from it and prevent it from happening again. As part of her response to my letter, I hope the minister also clarifies her expectations for the recruitment and assessment policies which regulate adoption agencies in Alberta. It's critical that Albertans of all backgrounds, faiths, sexual and gender orientations have equal access to adoption services in Alberta. I also hope the minister will clarify how she will help these families directly affected by the sudden closure of Adoptions by Choice. Becoming an adoptive parent is already a difficult journey. It's filled with highs and lows, joys and sorrows. Unfortunately, the journey for these parents has become unnecessarily filled with sadness and pain, and for some, it means their journey has now ended. These families deserve answers, Mr. Speaker, and I hope the minister will provide them.
The honourable member for Airdrie East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise in the Assembly today to recognize the establishment of the Victims of Crime Working Group that I will serve as co-chair with my colleague, the honourable member from Grand Prairie. The Victims of Crime Working Group will closely review the model for Victims Assistance Program, which will replace the Financial Benefits Program. This group will also examine what aspects of the current service delivery model will work well, where there are gaps, and provide suggestions for solutions. We will be working with a wide range of stakeholders to update the service delivery model to better address the needs of victims in Alberta. The feedback received by this group will help to ensure that Victims of Crime Fund has the best possible capability to support victims. Mr. Speaker, from day one, our government has said that we will do everything we can to protect Albertans and keep our communities safe. This is exactly the opposite of what the NDP did when they were in government, despite the scathing report from the Auditor General in 2016. It took the NDP until just prior to an election to release a very small portion of funds to a very select group of recipients. It is interesting to hear that the opposition fearmonger over Bill 16, as we have increased fines in this province, and then therefore increasing revenues for the fund, allowing us to expand the scope by supporting more preventative measures, thus reducing the amount of actual victims in the first place, and all while maintaining funding levels to organizations serving victims in our province. Our government has actually taken action to reduce crime, unlike the NDP. And again, unlike the NDP, we are actually committed to supporting victims in this province. Mr. Speaker, we must ensure that victims of crime in Alberta have the support that they need as they navigate the most difficult and challenging times in their lives. I am happy to be part of the solution as co-chair of the Victims of Crime Working Group and bring attention to public safety and crime prevention. I'm so grateful for the work being done in my constituency of Airdrie East, even though they were overlooked when the NDP finally got around to giving out additional funds at an interesting time before an election.
The honourable member for Calgary South East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Our educational institutions help lay the foundation upon which the future leaders of our province will build. The communities of my constituency have grown rapidly over the years, dramatically outpacing the necessary school infrastructure. I am happy to report that 5 new schools are now in various stages of construction to meet this demand. These include the long overdue Auburn Bay Middle School, Auburn Bay Second Elementary School, Cranston Second Elementary School, Mahogany Elementary School, and St. Johnna Catholic School, which is also an elementary school. As you may have noticed, Mr. Speaker, my constituency is full of young families and a multitude of children. In addition to the record funding of over $8 billion allocated to K-12 education this year, these schools speak to our government's commitment to strong and accessible public education. Currently, Alberta Education provides up to $250,000 per eligible school to support the construction of a playground. I'm happy to report that each of the upcoming elementary schools in my constituency are receiving this funding. On June 2nd, the Minister of Education announced an additional $5 million to help construct 26 play structures that had previously been planned but not funded. Prior to this, the development of these 26 playgrounds relied solely upon independent fundraising efforts from school communities and parent associations. Playgrounds contribute to the physical and social development of our children and enrich the communities in which they are located. I would like to thank the Minister of Education on behalf of my constituents in Calgary Southeast, especially the multitudes of children, and I look forward to seeing children in my constituency benefit from these schools and playgrounds. Thank you, and thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cypress Medicine Hat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the world's most successful inventors was prolific inventor and commercialization business person Thomas Edison. Edison lived and invented in the later 1800s and early 1900s. This era's innovation and invention successes were outstanding, perhaps second to no other era. The developments in electricity, automobiles, airplanes, manufacturing, telephone, and photography speak for themselves. Edison knew perhaps intuitively, but more likely through many years of trial and error, that layers and layers of rules and regulation were stifling innovation. In fact, one of his many famous quotes addresses the need to unhinge positive creativity. Mr. Speaker, he said, "There are no rules here. We're trying to accomplish something." And accomplish they did. Where would we be if Edison had been stopped from creating his hallmark inventions by endless red tape? Contrast this with today's world. Pipelines have been canceled or heavily subsidized by taxpayer funds after billion-dollar delays, investments foregone or placed elsewhere because permits either take too long, cost too much, and the burden of taxation makes a return on capital very uncertain. Business is driven by profit. However, there is only profit if there is a need or demand in the market for it from consumers. The entire process of meeting market demand brings investment dollars for economies by creating jobs in research and development, manufacturing, sales, and much, much more. As we work to come out of the economic lockdown brought on by COVID-19, staying true to the principles of free enterprise remain vital to our economic success. Governments do have a small role to play in the economy, such as ensuring a level playing field for businesses to operate and ensuring fair rules for all employees. Even so, governments need to be sure to get out of the way of progress, ensure that the tax burden is minimal, and maintain the economic environment to allow modern-day Edisons to be free to innovate and create.
Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Presenting petitions, notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill 22, the Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2020. Bill 22 comes at a time when Albertans need assurance about our support for the economy. Like all red tape reduction initiatives, this bill works to make Alberta one of the freest and fastest moving economies in the world. In total, it recommends 14 legislative changes across 6 ministries. All of the changes can be placed into 4 categories: expediting government approvals, reducing the administrative burden on municipalities, enhancing government transparency and eliminating outdated requirements, and promoting job creation and economic growth by eliminating unnecessary burdens on Albertans and businesses. These legislative changes represent another major step forward in reducing the regulatory burden placed on Albertans and businesses by 1/3. We have already reduced red tape by 5% in our first year of this government's mandate. Mr. Speaker, as we work to reopen Alberta, we must ensure that our job creators have the utmost support from government. They are the ones who will get Albertans back to work. And in many cases, the best support we as government can offer is to get out of their way. That's the core purpose of red tape reduction, and I believe Bill 22 demonstrates it. I look forward to providing more detail on the proposed legislation in the coming days. I hereby move first reading of Bill 22, the Red Tape Reduction Act.
The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Red Tape Reduction, has moved first reading of Bill 22, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2020. All those in favour of the motion for first reading, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. In my opinion, the ayes have it. That motion is carried and so ordered.
Bill 22, Red Tape Reduction Implementation Act 2020 is now read a first time.
Members, we are at oral question period, and the leader of Her Majesty's official opposition has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. While this government is proposing rules for vaping in Alberta, their legislation will do nothing to address the real problem of addiction. This is on purpose. The Premier caved to his friends in the big tobacco lobby, giving them exactly what they wanted: no flavour ban, no limit on nicotine. This goes against all the evidence of Alberta Health Services and senior health officials, including our Chief Medical Officer of Health. To the Premier, why is he taking the advice of his former campaign manager turned tobacco lobbyist over the advice of Dr. Hinshaw?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm proud of the review that was led by Emily Nixon and our initiative to regulate vaping, which the NDP had 4 years to do and failed, Mr. Speaker. The proposed amendments include the power to regulate flavors and will use as needed, Mr. Speaker. Starting by aligning vaping regulation with tobacco, we believe that this will be effective based on the success that we've had historically with smoking. But it's true, we're not doing everything that the NDP could have done in their 4 years, just most of it, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Health will know, no matter how proud or disappointed he is with another member, there's no reason to use his name here in the chamber. The Honourable Official Opposition Leader.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Premier's former campaign manager, his party's former executive director, their former fundraising chair, they're all at the Premier's door. The list of lobbyists working for Big Tobacco reads like a VIP guest list for a UCP hospitality suite. Alberta Health Services says, quote, the tobacco industry has a documented history of seeking to deliver high concentrations of nicotine, end quote. Looks like that worked. Premier, when will you stop listening to your friends and start protecting the health of Albertans?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The review was open to all stakeholders, including the tobacco industry. And we designed an open process which respected the guidelines of the WHO, Mr. Speaker, on interaction with the industry. Meeting notes are posted on the website, including details of all those who attended. The suggestion of the NDP of undue influence is just plain politics, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Opposition.
Speaker, here's the thing. Numerous health officials, including the Chief Medical Officer of Health, leading us through this pandemic, told them to do more. The public agrees. The government's own survey showed 66% of Albertans support banning flavors. So Albertans want it, health officials want it, Dr. Hinshaw wants it, but the only people these guys are listening to are their friends and insiders. And who suffers? Young people developing addictions. Why won't this Premier put their health ahead of private profiteering of friends and insiders?
The Honourable, the Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, the NDP's use of Dr. Hinshaw's reputation for their own political purposes is just the saddest political stunt, Mr. Speaker, especially considering the amount of times they've attacked her advice during the pandemic. The chief MOHs from all provinces signed a public statement in January which endorsed measures to protect our youth. The statement said the flavors and nicotine content would be best addressed federally. That's the words that were used in that statement, Mr. Speaker. In other words, the provinces should consider further measures if the federal government doesn't act, which is exactly what I announced, Mr. Speaker, and our government's commitment to Albertans.
The Honourable, the Leader of the Official Opposition, for her second set of questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, but many provinces have acted anyway. Now, for many kids, returning to school this fall will be difficult. They will be behind, and they will need extra help, and they will also need to keep them safe. School boards have to fundamentally rethink how our classrooms will work. Yet, this minister is asking them to do triple the planning with no new resources, no new funding, and no guidance until at least August. To the Premier, you keep bragging about the size of your pandemic response, but there's nothing for schools. In fact, you cut them. Why are kids always at the bottom of the Premier's priority list?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for the question. Every school authority is receiving an increase in their funding for the upcoming school year, and they are expected to work within their budget. But I am very happy to say that we were able to announce yesterday a very comprehensive re-entry plan which allows students to return to school while continuing to protect the health and safety of our staff and students. Thank you.
The Honourable the Leader of the Opposition.
Well, the Premier slashed per-student funding, and he knows it. Let me walk the Premier through the problem he's created. This fall, more kids will walk into schools. There will be fewer teachers and support staff and bigger class sizes. That's because of his budget. Now, because of the pandemic, schools will need more custodial services, more classroom space, but with smaller class sizes, more teachers. You don't need elementary math to know this doesn't add up, Mr. Speaker. The Premier is setting up school boards, teachers, and most importantly, our kids for failure. Why?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have worked very closely with school boards, with the College of Alberta School Superintendents, with the ATA, with the parent groups, to ensure that we have a very strong re-entry plan, and that's exactly what we presented to the public yesterday. We will continue to work with school authorities in the coming months to ensure that we have everything necessary to make it a successful re-entry. We have developed what I believe to be a very comprehensive education re-entry plan. We're very proud of it, and we are looking forward to welcoming our students back in September.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Well, her plan has created stress and questions and nothing else. By not properly funding enrollment, this Premier is forcing school boards to fire teachers and raise school fees. This week in Edmonton alone, we've lost 178 teachers and 429 educational assistants, leaving thousands of special needs students without support. This Premier's deep cuts to education will be felt long after the pandemic. It will last a generation. He thinks it's okay to pocket taxpayers' dollars for his own political party, but he's happy to sacrifice the future of our children. Why, Mr. Speaker, why?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We have been and we've always been committed to providing a world-class, high-quality education for our children, and that starts with more money getting to the classroom. And in fact, under our new funding model, that's exactly what's happening. As I said yesterday, the Edmonton Public School Division last year received $1.017 billion. This year, they will be receiving $1.031 billion. I have many quotes that I could read from other school divisions that have endorsed the new funding model, and I look forward to sharing those with you in the days to come.
Here. The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora has the call.
I'm proud of how students, staff, and families have stepped up to get through these tough times, made even tougher by the UCP, who've laid off more than 20,000 education staff and are doubling down on their cuts, forcing even more layoffs at a time where Albertans need more support, Mr. Speaker, not less. So yesterday, I was very disappointed to hear that no new resources would be available to help schools relaunch. Premier, you might have said that the minister misspoke. I'll give you an opportunity. Will you commit to providing new resources to help schools bring students back safely?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to reiterate what the plan is for the upcoming year. School authorities will be planning for 3 scenarios for September. The first being the in-school class resumes near normal operations with health measures. The second being in-school classes partially resume with additional health measures. And at-home learning is the third scenario where in-school classes are cancelled. Of course, our preferred option is that most likely we will be in scenario 1. I'm very happy to say that. I know parents are looking forward to that, where students will be able to return to their daily classes with near normal operations.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
To quote the minister, school divisions have within their budget the ability to allocate funds and resources to address these needs, end quote. But the translation is that the province won't provide a single nickel to help schools relaunch. The minister will force every taxpayer to cough up additional money to support her partisan hacks at UCP headquarters, but no money for kids. Schools need extra cleaning supplies, they need PPE, they need more staff to keep each other safe, and this government is cutting their budgets. Will the Premier at the very least commit to paying for PPE for schools that need them to keep kids safe?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I continue to share the information that this reentry plan was made in consultation, very close consultation over weeks and weeks with all of our education partners, and we have been working with them, and we will continue to work with them to ensure that they have what they need to have a successful reentry plan.
Hear, hear. The Honourable Member.
A big old no, Mr. Speaker, and she's not giving any additional support to ensure that kids and staff are safe. Yesterday, the minister left more questions unanswered than answered. She couldn't answer the questions about PPE, physical distancing, cleaning, all things that parents and staff have said are critical before the relaunch. And since this minister is continuing her cuts, we are seeing more job losses at a time where teachers are telling us that they are stressed, overwhelmed, and need more help. More than 600 fewer workers in Edmonton Public Schools alone, and this minister says there's no problem. Will the Premier finally listen to the concerns of Albertans, step up and provide answers?
The Honourable the Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is very disappointing to see members opposite critiquing the expert advice of our Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Dina Hinshaw. We have developed a very comprehensive education reentry plan which allows students to return to school while continuing to protect the health and safety of our staff and students. The health and safety of our staff and students is #1 priority. It will always be #1 priority, and we are working with school divisions and all of our education partners to ensure that that continues.
Hear, hear. Honourable Member for Lethbridge West is the one with the call.
The fiscal reckoning the UCP is threatening has taken an interesting turn. It's going to definitely affect businesses, families, doctors, patients, but one group is surprisingly unaffected, the Premier's inner circle. His principal advisor has already caused one scandal with luxury hotel expenses, just handed us another bill for more than $58,000 in luxury expenses. Before we get more UCP lectures about a fiscal reckoning, could the Finance Minister start by reining in David Knightleg's luxury expenses?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Firstly, we make no apology for reaching out to the global investment community to attract investment into this province. Mr. Speaker, that is something the members opposite failed to do when they were in government. That is not a mistake we will make. Mr. Speaker, it's rich to be lectured on travel costs from the members opposite. Back in 2017, the then Premier, the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, a minister and 6 staff spent $10,000 in 5 nights, Mr. Speaker. We will not be lectured on costs.
The order. I think that you must be. The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Quote, custom furnishings, pristine marble bathrooms, opulent bedding. Our guest rooms and suites are immersive escapes high above Manhattan. Quote, uncompromising indulgence with luxury amenities. But no itinerary or accountability, Mr. Speaker. This finance minister raised everyone's income tax, property tax, gouged everyone with new fees. Why is the finance minister hiking up all of our taxes and fees to pay for David Knightleg to sleep in opulent bedding and sit atop a marble throne?
The Honourable President of Treasury Board and the Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, there has not been a government, I believe, in the history of this province that raised taxes like the members opposite did when they were in office. Mr. Speaker, they brought in the carbon tax, which was the largest single tax increase on Albertans in its history. Mr. Speaker, they did it without any permission. They didn't campaign on it, Mr. Speaker. The members opposite are the kings and queens of raising taxes in this province.
The Honourable Member for Lethbridge West.
Well, now that carbon tax is going to Ottawa and it's coming back to Albertans in the form of a subsidy for UCP partisan hacks, Mr. Speaker. This is a finance minister who also thinks taxpayers should pay for his party fundraising hacks, exploiting a program that was supposed to help struggling business. We get higher taxes and fiscal reckoning. The UCP cronies get the good life. Will the Premier give back the money he took from Canadian taxpayers and order David Knightleg to repay his luxury travel bills?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance, President of Treasury Board.
Again, Mr. Speaker, we make no apology for having an expert in international investment banking out there seeking to attract investment back into the province. Mr. Speaker, investment that the members opposite chased out by the billions as they raised taxes on Alberta businesses. Mr. Speaker, as they added red tape and regulatory burden, Mr. Speaker, we will not make that mistake. We will deliver for Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This week, Premier announced that Phase 2 of relaunch can begin tomorrow, a week ahead of schedule. This is great news for so many Albertans who have made sacrifices to stop the spread of COVID-19 and are now eager to relaunch our economy. We know that childcare centres and preschools have been hit hard by the public health emergency and the mandated closures. To the Minister of Children's Services, how are you going to ensure that this sector is restarting, financially viable, and able to support our parents and children to get back to work?
The Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. As a working mom of 2 young children, I know how incredibly important childcare is for working parents across this province. I want this sector to succeed and to thrive, and I am working to support that. Mr. Speaker, our government is providing $19 million in sector-specific support to ensure parents have safe and affordable options for their children. This supports centres to offset around 25% of costs that were not covered by other support packages, purchasing sanitation and cleaning supplies, and funding recruitment of both families and staff. Childcare centres asked for this, and we're happy to support them.
The Honourable Member for Grand Prairie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and to the Minister. Given that Premier announced this week that Stage 2 is slated to begin tomorrow, and given that daycares, out-of-school care, family day homes, and preschools have indicated they're grateful for this funding, but that the mandated cohort size has proven challenging for their business models, and further given that many working parents rely on such programs and services for childcare so that they can return to work. To the same Minister, what does this actually mean for the childcare sector and for working parents?
Honourable, the Minister of Children's Services.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We heard similar feedback from the sector, and we've been working very closely with the Chief Medical Officer of Health, incorporating that feedback we've heard from the reopened centres, and we are updating the health and safety guidelines for those centres to operate. Centres will now be able to operate in cohorts of 30, up from the previous amount of 10, and centres that operate in large open spaces will also now be able to divide their spaces out, since the requirement for floor-to-ceiling drywall dividers has been removed. Mr. Speaker, we'll continue to listen to these centre operators.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again to the Minister. Given that accelerated relaunch is welcome news for many Albertans eager to get back to work, and given childcare operators across the province are looking forward to resuming their operations, further given there are tough times still ahead for our economy, and that women in particular have been disproportionately impacted by this pandemic, to the same Minister, what are your plans to ensure the long-term sustainability of our childcare sector to support children, families, and in particular working moms as Alberta opens up?
The Order, the Honourable Member for Children's Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I absolutely believe that childcare is a hugely important piece of our economic recovery, and supporting women to return to work is important to this government. Albertans need and deserve a childcare system that is equitable, accessible, high quality, and affordable for those who need it most, while also preserving and respecting parent choice. Mr. Speaker, we're working with the federal government to ensure that funding goes to those who need it most, not those who are in the right place at the right time. Mr. Speaker, I'm also grateful to the member from Grand Prairie who is taking on this important work of leading these consultations on our Child Care Licensing Act.
Member for Edmonton City Centre has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, the government's plan to distribute non-medical masks to Albertans using drive-through restaurants was unorthodox, but when it was announced, indeed, the concept looked reasonable. Since then, Albertans have raised several serious questions about how the plan has been executed. First off, constituents and others have been asking me why these masks are being packed into bags of 4 in the back rooms of drive-through restaurants. If this is a public health initiative, why were these masks not packed into bags of 4 by government before being distributed to restaurants?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm very happy to highlight and bring attention to this initiative. It's an initiative where I think Alberta is the first and only province to distribute masks province-wide to folks, and we're very happy to have been able to partner with A&W, McDonald's Canada, and Tim Hortons to be able to distribute In each box, there's about 2,000 of these masks, Mr. Speaker, and depending on the direction of each of these restaurant chains, they directed a certain amount of box, between 16 and maybe about 30, to each of these restaurants for them to assist in the distribution as well as the packaging of these masks, packaging 4 at a time so they can be distributed to Albertans.
The honourable member for Edmonton City Centre.
Given that we'll see, Mr. Speaker, if we can get an actual answer, and given that we have seen widespread reports of restaurants giving out far more masks per visit than the minister planned for, sometimes up to 10 times more. And given that these are drive-thrus, so it's not a question of people taking too many, they're being given too many. So what has this government done to fix this problem, to address actual distribution, and how many additional masks may they actually need to buy then in order to make up for possible shortage?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, so there's 2 tranches of distribution. The first is this first 20 million. The next 20 million will be later on, perhaps in the beginning weeks of July. To date, we've had, I think, a total masks distributed since June 8th, a total of 2.125 million masks out of that first 20 million have been distributed by those restaurants. I'd also note that they're not the only ones distributing the masks, Mr. Speaker. We also have 44 municipalities. We have 46 First Nations. We have 7 Métis settlements. We have 14 seniors organizations. We have 38 women's shelters. We have 24 homeless shelters, Mr. Speaker. We have street outreach programs who are also helping us distribute these to Albertans.
The honourable member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Now, given that with this distribution program, we have no idea of how many are actually getting to what number of individual Albertans, and given that it's clear that these drive-thrus and their staff were not properly prepared or trained to take on the task of distributing public safety equipment, and given that Alberta taxpayers paid for these masks and have a right to know why they are not being distributed properly, will the government table the agreements it signed with these drive-thru restaurants so Albertans can judge for themselves why this plan has stumbled?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Mr. Speaker, these partner organizations, including the 44 municipalities, the 46 First Nations, the 7 Métis settlements, etc., all of these partners are helping us distribute at their own cost, Mr. Speaker. We are not paying them. We are spending $350,000, though, for the gap distribution for folks who don't have access. Not every Albertan is within 10 kilometers, for example, of one of these drive-thrus. Not every Albertan has access to being able to get to a drive-thru. For that gap distribution and partnering with municipalities, partnering with seniors organizations, homeless shelters, long-term care facilities, foster care, Mr. Speaker, that gap distribution is going to be...
The honourable member for Edmonton West, Henday.
When in government, our caucus took steps to protect consumers from skyrocketing insurance costs by capping insurance rates. This government pulled the rug out from under Albertans by lifting this cap, letting rates climb by up to 30%. Their response to Albertans paying huge increases has been to appoint yet another panel to study the issue and report back. So I'm hoping that today the minister can please confirm when his panel will report back and on what date he will make his report public. We're waiting.
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and the President of Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we're a government that believes in being informed prior to making great policy decisions that affect Albertans, unlike the members opposite. Mr. Speaker, we are expecting the report from the panel in the upcoming days. They're working to finalize that report. And Mr. Speaker, we're looking forward to the report. Auto insurance is a very complex area. We've worked to understand the cost drivers that are creating the increase in premiums for Albertans. Mr. Speaker, we are about providing a solution.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton West Henday.
Given that when first presented with these huge jumps in insurance premiums, the minister's only action was to tell Albertans to, quote, shop around. And given that this minister's failure to act has meant that during a global pandemic and economic crisis, Albertans have been paying more at a time when many can't afford to. And given that this minister will proudly defend the use of Canadian tax dollars to subsidize his debt-ridden party office while refusing to lift a finger to help struggling consumers, does this minister have anything other than empty words to offer Albertans coping with insurance rate hikes?
The Honourable Minister of Finance, President, Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fact of the matter is we are acting when the members opposite failed to act. They brought in a Band-Aid fix that made a bad situation worse with a rate cap, Mr. Speaker. It resulted in less consumer choice for Albertans. Many were denied collision comprehensive coverage. Many were even denied access to coverage because, Mr. Speaker, a rate cap is simply a Band-Aid on a bad situation. We will not repeat that error. We will find substantive solutions for Albertans.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace. Oh, correction. Edmonton West Henday has his second supplemental.
Well, given that this minister made a decision to hurt the pocketbooks of Albertans without any plan, and it's been almost a year now, and given the UCP seems satisfied as long as the Premier got his reduction in his premiums, and given that many of those Albertans who drive themselves and their families have not seen the relief that the Premier bragged about, and given that the Minister of Finance can't offer a single solitary example of anything he's doing to support these Albertans, will the Minister of Finance restore the cap and give relief to those struggling as a result of insurance rate hikes, or is he calling it mission accomplished now that the Premier saved his $200?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance, President of Treasury Board.
Mr. Speaker, this government is in fact taking action. That's why we have implemented a panel to issue a report that will provide recommendations on a sustainable fix for automobile insurance premiums for Albertans. Mr. Speaker, the members opposite didn't have the courage to deal with this issue when they were in government. Mr. Speaker, we will deal with this issue. We will provide a solution for Albertans for their automobile insurance premiums.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley has a question.
This spring, concerns have come up in my constituency about the status of campgrounds in provincial parks. With camping season upon us, many of my constituents would like to continue to use the sites at Running Lake, Sulphur Lake, Stony Lake, and others. These beautiful locations in the north have produced countless fond memories for our Alberta families. We know that these sites will not be closed to public access, contrary to the misinformation spread by the always angry NDP. And we also know that local partnerships can be found to operate them. To the Minister, are you willing to work with local municipalities and community groups to operate these parks for the community, and if so, when will those details come forward?
The Honourable Minister of Parks.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. First of all, parks are not for sale. I appreciate the Honourable Member pointing that out, and none of those facilities are closed, despite what the NDP has said, Mr. Speaker. Yes, this government is interested in working with non-profit organizations. That's what we ran on our campaign, Mr. Speaker, and we've been doing that inside this province for a very, very long time. It's unfortunate that the NDP have never respected the non-profit and conservation organizations that have partnered with my department and with the National Park Service inside this province, including right in you and I's backyard. The Friends of the Eastern Slopes for decades have worked to protect one of the most beautiful places in the world, the Yaha Tinda Ranch.
The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Given that Albertans expect fiscal responsibility in the delivery of government services, and given that partnerships between local communities, nonprofits, and the municipalities are a cost-effective way to keep campgrounds open and available to all Albertans, and since the NDP anger machine across the aisle has misled Albertans that parks will be sold and closed off to public use, can the Minister clear the air again for us in this legislature and for the residents of the Peace Country about the situation with the selling of provincial parks that the NDP accuse you of?
The Honourable, the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, the Honourable Member, for the question. It's an important question. It is disappointing to see the angry NDP continue to misrepresent facts inside this chamber and elsewhere, Mr. Speaker. But to answer that question, I will refer you to their environment critic, the Honourable Member from Edmonton Gold Bar, and his quotes right here in this chamber just the other day on June 9th, Mr. Speaker. You can say, he says, "I just want to clarify, though, one thing that the member said about the fact that parks aren't for sale. I just want to say that I agree with the Minister of Transportation when he says that parks are not for sale, Mr. Speaker." So there you go, Mr. Speaker. Those are the facts presented by the opposition critic.
Point of order is noted. The Honourable Member for Central Peace Notley.
Given that this government is dedicated to the well-being of our parks, public lands, and our environment, and given that the angry NDP's attempts to suggest otherwise finds them grasping at straws and playing fast and loose with the truth, and seeing that this government wishes to ensure Albertans have access to public lands, will the Minister commit to responsible conservation of sensitive areas, and any funds spent on habitat and land protection will be done with Alberta organizations like the Alberta Fish and Game Association, Alberta Conservation Association, and others that value not only the conservation education, but also reasonable access to protected lands for Albertans.
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Parks.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, we are 100% dedicated to that, unlike the NDP when they were in power, Mr. Speaker, who went to our communities with foreign-funded organizations trying to sterilize the land for both economic and recreation development, including right in my very own backyard, Mr. Speaker, outside of Rocky Mountain House and Sundry, where they tried to stop us from having access to our backyard, Mr. Speaker. This government will always make sure Albertans have access to their wild places, and we're not ashamed to partner with them to be able to manage the beautiful places that, Mr. Speaker, they have managed already for decades inside our province.
The order, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A dozen conservation and Indigenous groups from Alberta have written to the Federal Environment Minister asking him to reinstate the environmental monitoring that Alberta unilaterally suspended without consultation. These groups include the Fort Chipewyan Métis Local 125, Smith's Landing First Nation, and Mikisew Cree. To the Minister, did your office get a call from these groups first, and why are these First Nations and Métis communities asking the federal government to do your job?
The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, the Alberta Energy Regulator is responsible for this issue, Mr. Speaker. They're independent from government, Mr. Speaker, and they've been clear what is taking place when it comes to this important issue, Mr. Speaker. But as we have brought up inside this House before, the AER underneath this government is not a corrupt organization like it was underneath the NDP government. And that member was part of that government who oversaw an organization that was called out by every legislative officer of this chamber, Mr. Speaker, including the Auditor General, who's looking for $2.4 million. Does that member know where the $2.4 million is?
The Honourable the Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that starting tomorrow, people will be able to go to movie theaters, swim in public pools, and go to casinos, and given that First Nations groups have said that they need deadlines, not vague ideas, on when the monitoring will resume, can the Minister tell the House when he plans to restore this critical monitoring? Will it be this week, next month, next year?
The Honourable the Minister of Environment and Parks.
Again, Mr. Speaker, the AER is an independent organization of government, but 98% of monitoring remains inside the province of Alberta. There has been slight changes to be able to accommodate staff during the COVID situation, and that will adjust as we reopen, Mr. Speaker. But again, I see the Honourable Member is avoiding the question. He was a cabinet minister in charge of an AER who was described by the Auditor General and the Ethics Commissioner as corrupt, and that they're looking for $2.3 million, Mr. Speaker. So does that member know where the $2.3 million is? Does that member know where the $2.3 million is? Does that member know where the $2.3 million is, Mr. Speaker? Let's talk about what's going on with the $2.3 million.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Rutherford.
You can ignore First Nations at your peril. Given that earlier this week, 3 different First Nations, the Mikisew Cree First Nation, the Fort McKay First Nation, and the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation are appealing the regulator's decision to suspend monitoring, and given that despite the decision's impact on their treaty rights, the First Nations were not consulted, can the Minister explain to this House and to those nations why his government continues to suspend the monitoring without any clear rationale linking it to public health, emergency, and safety?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Parks.
First of all, the Alberta government has not suspended any monitoring. The Alberta government has provided some leeway in reporting to be able to provide some extensions during the COVID situation. The Honourable Member is referring to the Alberta Energy Regulator, who is independent of this government, Mr. Speaker, though I am very proud that the Minister of Energy and myself were able to fire the AER that worked for that Honourable Member, who again, Mr. Speaker, $2.3 million went missing under his watch with the Alberta Energy Regulator. And Mr. Speaker, I'm just trying to help the Auditor General. Does he know where the $2.3 million is? Because the Auditor General would be interested. Maybe some of his colleagues do. I don't know.
Well, they like to politically...
The order, the Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Due to the ongoing public health emergency, almost all colleges and universities across Alberta are proceeding with online classes this fall semester. However, due to deep operating cuts handed down by this UCP government, post-secondary institutions like the U of A, the University of Calgary have said that they must hand down the same rate of tuition, raised by 7% in the last UCP budget, to the Zoom University. So can the Minister of Advanced Education please explain why he's forcing post-secondary students to pay more for online education?
The Honourable the Minister of Advanced Education. Education.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answer to that question is quite simply, we're not forcing anybody to do anything, of course. As the member opposite hopefully knows, that our post-secondary institutions are independent in their decision-making, and it's important for this government to not interject and interfere as to how those institutions make their operational decisions. It's our job as government to give them the tools and resources that they need to continue their operations, and I know that our post-secondary institutions are making prudent decisions as we head into the fall to ensure that our students remain safe, and I believe moving to online is a very safe and prudent decision.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, Mr. Speaker, given that post-secondary institutions had their budget cut by this government, thus forcing them to increase tuition, and given that students will also be paying less for their education and due to cuts and reducing program choice as well, American Sign Language classes having to be cut at the U of A, Lakeland College lost 5 trade programs. I'm sure the minister has calculated how many students won't even be able to enroll this fall because of tuition hikes, program cuts, and online classes. How many less students does this minister expect to come? 8%, 10%, 15%?
The Honourable Minister of Advanced Education.
Well, Mr. Speaker, what we do know is that under the former government, the action that they took did nothing to increase enrollment in our post-secondary institutions. So you'll forgive me, Mr. Speaker, if I don't take lessons from those members when it comes to expanding access and enrollment in our post-secondary institutions. And as well, let's continue to look at their record. Despite increases in funding, post-secondary participation remained flat over the years that those members were in government. That is why we are working with our institutions to come up with innovative ways to drive enrollment, including ambitious plans at the U of A to increase enrollment by 25%.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Northwest.
Well, given that other Conservative governments in other provinces have reversed their deep cuts to the sector and chosen to invest in colleges and universities, and given that other governments has also committed to providing emergency financial assistance to students, freezing or reducing tuition given the emergency that we're in, I know that this minister is capable of reversing bad ideas. I've seen it do them a couple of times this past week. How about giving students a break on tuition, at least while they must be taking classes on Zoom or Skype or other online platforms?
The Honourable Minister.
Well, again, Mr. Speaker, I leave the decision when it comes to tuition to our individual institutions. It's important for them to make those operational decisions. The member opposite wants to talk about investment into post-secondary education. I'm very proud to talk about the investment of over $11 million to Careers Next Generation to quadruple the number of students who participate in apprenticeship programming, as well $10 million to Women Building Futures to help more women pursue apprenticeship learning. Because we believe those are important post-secondary pathways, Mr. Speaker, and we will indeed deliver a stronger post-secondary system.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Fish Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 has had a disastrous and what may be enduring impact on the airline industry. WestJet furloughed half its staff and is losing up to $25 million per day. Air Canada lost over $1 billion this past quarter. Considering that the airline industry is a significant employer and contributor to GDP in Alberta, to the Minister of Transportation, what supports are available from both provincial and federal governments to get them through what is arguably a game-changing crisis?
The Minister of Transportation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Alberta's airline industry, the member's right, was hit hard by COVID-19. That's why I was pleased to see the Honourable Member from Calgary-Fish Creek introduce Bill 201, the Strategic of Aviation Advisory Council. This bill will build on Alberta's rich aviation history and make recommendations to secure regional, national, and international air services. We look forward to learning through this process what more we can do to make sure that our airlines are successful now and into the future, because it's a key part of economic development and success for Alberta.
The Honourable Member for Calgary-Fish Creek.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that many airlines have significantly reduced passenger capacity, some by over 90%, while still being responsible for billions of dollars of assets and fixed costs, and given that many consumers are uneasy about the health considerations around air travel, as well as uncertainty with respect to government restrictions on passenger acceptance, to the same minister, how is our government working with the federal authorities to ensure that we can keep our airlines as a truly essential service in a modern global world viable during these challenging times?
The Minister of Transportation.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And in fact, we're actually going above and beyond. We're actually kind of doing the federal government's job for them to a certain degree. Our Premier went to an airport early on in the COVID crisis and found that there wasn't adequate screening, there wasn't adequate advice on sheltering and those types of things. So we've actually, along the way, put Alberta health people there to give information to travelers coming in about the obligations to shelter for 14 days when they're coming from another country, and advice on keeping socially distanced, washing their hands and other things. We've actually gone above and beyond to do the federal government's job for them.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister. Given the importance of both local and international airlines in providing choice, convenience in fares, routes, and frequency, and given the decimation of passenger traffic and the likelihood of a complete rethink of operations will further challenge financial sustainability within the sector, again to the Minister, what is our government doing to help Alberta-based or operating carriers to relaunch vital air services given the well over 100 destinations served from Alberta pre-COVID-19?
The Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Part of our advances that we are doing to maintenance and stuff includes a STIP program, which amongst other things helps small regional airports, offers them an opportunity to do some improvements to their individual regional airports. We're also working to make sure to create the overall business-friendly atmosphere, because as airports are important to the economic development of Alberta, the economic development of Alberta is important to airports. We're trying to work both ends, Mr. Speaker, because they are together.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
The town of Nordegg has a proud coal mining history, but today in the 21st century, Clearwater County describes it as, quote, Alberta's fastest growing mountain resort community. The Nordegg area includes some of Alberta's finest hiking trails, which attract tourists from all over the world, but the Minister of the Environment seems to have other plans for the area. Why did he quietly change the rules to allow open-pit coal mining at some of Clearwater County's best outdoor tourism sites?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Parks.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as you know, because you come from Nordegg, Nordegg has a proud history of coal mining, Mr. Speaker, and Nordegg is a great and beautiful community, Mr. Speaker, that has balanced economic growth at the same time as environmental protection for decades, Mr. Speaker. Environmental protection rules remain in place. There is no coal mine approved, as the Honourable Member is referring to, Mr. Speaker, but there is a process in place with the Alberta Energy Regulator to make sure all environmental rules are followed before any mine would be approved, Mr. Speaker. But that there is the big difference between us and that party, Mr. Speaker. We are dedicated to protecting the environment, but we're not ashamed of companies that create jobs in our communities.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Given that the Minister is on record as saying that he would not make any land use decisions outside of the North Saskatchewan Regional Plan, and given that his move from outdoor tourism to open-pit coal mining is a substantial change in land use, did the Minister consult with outdoor recreation employers or municipalities or anyone other than coal industry lobbyists before he quietly announced these new rules on a Friday afternoon before a long weekend?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Parks.
Mr. Speaker, we have not made any land use decisions when it comes to the area. This is typical of the NDP, who mislead on things like parks or environmental decisions. The reality is no land use decisions have been made in this regard for the area around Nordegg, Mr. Speaker, but there is a process in place for that conversation to take place through the Alberta Energy Regulator. All environmental rules will continue to remain in place, Mr. Speaker, but let me be clear, our government believes we can find balance between protecting the environment and creating jobs, Mr. Speaker, and I will not ever be ashamed of standing up for employers in my community that will put my people to work, Mr. Speaker, for multiple generations, Mr. Speaker. That's the difference between us and the NDP, who are going to let our towns die.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Gold Bar.
Well, given the Minister means Australian companies employing coal miners and nobody else, and given that Robin Campbell, president of the Coal Association of Canada, says the industry is quite pleased that at least half a dozen coal mines are now allowed where they were previously prohibited, and given that some members of this cabinet have belatedly realized that tourism is actually a crucial component of any economic diversification plan, will the Minister give us a straight answer about whether he believes the future of the Eastern Slopes is an outdoor tourism or is it an open-pit coal mining?
The Honourable Member.
Mr.
Minister
Speaker,
of
the
Environment.
future of this province is in many different industries, including tourism, and yes, metallurgical coal, which creates the steel that we depend on across this world, Mr. Speaker. This, again, is the difference between us and the NDP. You just saw it there with the NDP. They want to attack an employer that may come to our province and invest capital from Australia to create jobs for the people of Rimbey, Rocky Mountain House, Sundre, and elsewhere inside this province, Mr. Speaker, and that honourable member wants to attack them. No wonder underneath his government, billions of dollars fled this province, Mr. Speaker. I want to assure you, Mr. Speaker, and all Albertans, Alberta is open for business. We'll protect our environment, and we'll put our people back to work.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Last May, the Minister of Seniors and Housing acknowledged Alberta's seniors population will grow from 13% to 19% of Alberta's population by 2035. The Minister made a commitment to work closely with stakeholders to, quote, ensure that seniors' concerns are heard. To the Minister, given the growing distrust with private care homes and their response to COVID-19, what consultations do you have planned with seniors and their families to ensure you do hear their concerns?
The Honourable the Minister of Seniors and Housing is rising.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for that very important questions. And so far, Mr. Speaker, we hold 3 town halls with over 1,000 individuals or organizations and exchange information. Make sure we get updated information and get tailor different kinds of information solutions and meet their needs. And on top of my team has been working closely with all the leaders with the organization and make sure they provide all the updated information and fix all the problems right away.
The honourable member for Edmonton Riverview.
Given that the Minister recognized that 4,800 senior households are on the wait list to access nearly 25,000 senior housing units in Alberta, and given that the majority of these facilities are in desperate need of renovation, repairs, and upgrades, to the Minister, since May of last year, what changes have been made to directly address this concern?
The Honourable the Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speakers. We will continue to work closely with our housing partner to ensure safe and maintenance housing units available for Albertans with low income. This will allow us to make the best use of our capital maintenance and review dollars. Mr. Speaker, we have to make sure the way to make the Albertans' affordable housing system more sustainable for future generations.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Riverview.
Well, given, Mr. Speaker, that's a whole bunch of nothing. Given that when asked by the member from Calgary East in this House, when will Alberta seniors' concerns be addressed, the Minister said the work is already underway. And given that many months passed before the COVID-19 pandemic, which has disproportionately impacted senior Albertans, and given that the Minister has made a commitment to meeting with seniors in Alberta, to the Minister again, please update the Assembly on exactly what work has been done and when we can expect to see the Seniors Action Plan, which was promised last year.
The Honourable Member or Minister of Seniors and Housing.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As I mentioned again, that we continue to have contact with organizations and town hall, and that also that we that allocates $30 million, the FCC's funding, and for our senior organizations to make sure that we provide the support to all the seniors home, large and long-term care. And also, that's very important that the well-being and health are most important to this government, and they are my first priority.
The Honourable Member for Spruce Grove, order. The Honourable Member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain has a call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last couple of weeks, I've been contacted by a number of parents from across my riding of Spruce Grove and Stony Plain about the need to get children outside and active again. While the reopening of playgrounds in my riding was a great first step, many parents are still waiting for announcements from our government on when more options will be available. To the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women, what steps has our government already taken to relax conditions around areas that encourage Albertans to be active?
The Honourable the Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and thank you most of all to Albertans who have made it absolutely possible to be successful and to actually move into stage 2. On June 4th, we were honoured to participate with over 2,000 members of the sport and fitness community, and actually they were absolutely imperative in helping us create the documents that will come forward to make sure that we can get our munchkins out and playing as safely and as soon as possible.
Member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that we all understand the need for Albertans to be regularly active, and given that many parents are looking forward to the reopening of areas like rinks, gyms, and indoor facilities, and given that these areas have not yet been reopened by our government, to the Minister of Health, what additional options can parents expect to have when our government enters stage 2 of our relaunch strategy tomorrow in order to keep their children active and healthy?
Honourable the Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indoor rec, fitness and sports, including gyms, pools and arenas, originally planned for stage 3, have been moved forward to reopen in stage 2. All these activities must comply with Alberta's public health guidelines, including physical distancing and frequent cleaning. And we've posted specific guidelines. They're online at alberta.ca/bizconnect, biz with a Z, Mr. Speaker, for indoor rec, but it's on all Albertans to apply these.
Member for Spruce Grove, Stony Plain.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given that many of my residents have asked about when their children can resume playing organized sports, and given that organized sports can provide a huge opportunity for youth to remain active, providing routine and structure to exercise, and given that our government just announced organized sports will also be allowed to begin on Friday, can the Minister talk about what issues impacted the decision to allow organized sports to resume, and what restrictions will continue in order to ensure the return of sports will not endanger the province's COVID-19 response?
The Honourable Minister of Culture, Multiculturalism and the Status of Women.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to echo what the Minister of Health said, is that the gyms and facilities were actually part of stage 3, but because of the great work of Albertans, we've been able to move that up to stage 2. They'll be able to open their doors tomorrow and comply with the guidelines. I actually am happy to table the guidelines today on the return to physical activity. Again, I'd like to thank Albertans from the bottom of all of our hearts for being able to move forward so quickly, and Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity.
The Honourable Member for Lacombe-Panoka.
Mr. Speaker, the horse racing industry is one of the oldest professional sports in Alberta, since 1882. With over 200 races a year now, the industry draws thousands of spectators and broadcasts across North America. This year, like many others, they were hit hard by COVID-19 shutdowns, and as we are entering phase 2 of our relaunch strategy, and other provinces such as Manitoba and Ontario have begun to allow the horse racing industry to start, to the Minister of Finance, when will Alberta follow the lead of other provinces and allow horse races in Alberta?
The Honourable the Minister of Finance and President of the Treasury Board.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. We've been working closely with the industry over the past month to really understand the challenges that this sector has been experiencing and the innovation that they can bring to safely restart their industry. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to say that horse racing in Alberta can resume their operations as stage 2 this Friday. Mr. Speaker, very pleased to announce that, and we were very pleased to work together with the industry to find solutions.
The Honourable Member for Lacombe-Panoka.
Thank you, Minister. The industry will thank you as well. Given that all professional sports have been hit hard by the COVID-19 regulations, and given that just recently Ontario and Manitoba have announced that they are allowing competitions and races to take place again without fans, given that Alberta racing organizations have submitted protocols with social distancing, staff practices, online fan participation, and it's outdoors, to the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism, when horse racing industry returns, what health protocols will they be expected to follow?
The Honourable Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Tourism.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member for the question. As part of the announcement of stage 2 of our relaunch, we have developed guidelines for horse and motor racing and have posted them on BizConnect. Some of the protocols for racing include a maximum number of spectators of 100, provided 2 meters of distancing between parties can be maintained, race scheduled with enough time for areas to be disinfected, and others. We have also added guidelines for casinos and racing entertainment centres, which will require them to submit an operational plan to AGLC and spacing around ticket kiosks.
The Honourable Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And given that many individuals in the province of Alberta rely on the sport for a livelihood, farmers growing feed, the trainers, the breeders, jockeys, and all the support staff at the racetracks, Given that since 2002, the sport is a net contributor of over $265 million to the Alberta Lottery Fund, and given that Horse Racing Alberta has already cancelled a lot of races and lost thousands of dollars of revenue, to the Minister of Finance, what supports are available to the horse racing industry?
Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And to the member for the question, as I mentioned, we've been working with the industry to understand their concerns and their challenges. And Mr. Speaker, this is an industry that contributes over $300 million in economic activity to Alberta annually, and much of that is in rural Alberta. Mr. Speaker, what I can say, we are currently finalizing a financial assistance plan that will ensure the success of horse racing this summer and into the future.
Members, in 30 seconds or less, we will return to the tablings of returns and reports.
Returns and reports.
Honourable members, is there anyone with a tabling? The Honourable Minister of Health.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have the requisite number of copies to table a return to sport, physical activity and recreation, stage 2, for consideration. And I deposited at the basket. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Is there, yes, you can place it in the tablings box on the tablings table. Is there any other tablings today? Oh, are you standing for a tabling or? Standing, sir. The might get you a phone book next time. The Honourable, the Associate Minister of Finance, Associate Minister of Electricity.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to table the requisite copies of a letter that I sent to the Mayor of St. Albert describing the inappropriate, divisive and unprofessional conduct of the member of St. Albert at a community event.
The only reason why I might make comment of a phone book is because I'm very familiar with the use of the phone book to make me just a little bit taller. Is there any other tablings? Looks like the Honourable Member for Lacombe-Panoke has also risen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two tablings, one from Track on 2, racing protocols and racing under COVID-19 that they have put forward to be able to move forward. And secondly, protocols and proposals for live standardbred racing in cooperation with the Track as well as the Alberta Standardbred Horse Racing Association. I have the requisite number of copies. Thank you.
Are there others? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I have the requisite number of copies of a tabling, which is a tweet from the now Premier from January 2015, where he says, "You have a strange definition of democracy if it involves compelling people to finance political parties against their will." I referred to this quote in a question I asked I believe it was last week, actually, Mr. Speaker, where, of course, the Premier is doing exactly that today. Thank you.
Would remind members that if a document has been tabled in this session, there isn't a requirement to table it again. I believe that document has been tabled previously, but it's not a huge deal, just a point of context for everyone. Is there anyone else that would like to table a document today? The clerk.
Tablings to the clerk. Deferred divisions.
Honourable members, we are at points of order, and at 2:16, the Honourable, 2:18, the Honourable, the member for Edmonton Gold Bar raised a point of order.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of the member from Gold Bar, the point of order being raised was 23H and I makes allegations against another member, imputes false or unavowed motives to another member. At 2:18, the government House Leader, while engaged in responding to friendly questions from his own government caucus, deliberately attempted to mislead this House by imputing motives against the member from Gold Bar in misquoting Hansard by deliberately taking a portion of a quote. I believe he was quoting from the June 9th Hansard, and to further my argument, I will read the full quote, which the government House Leader did not choose to use. The full quote reads, "I just want to say that I agree with the Minister of Transportation when he says that parks aren't for sale because technically they're not for sale. That is technically the truth. What is for sale is all of the facilities there and the land. So outside of the facilities and the land, nothing is for sale. You know, I will concede the point that only all of the facilities in our provincial parks and only all of the land in our provincial parks are for sale." And I want to thank the member for making that important technical clarification. By the government House Leader choosing to use the smallest portion at the front, I think he is obviously going completely counter to the intent, the message, and the motives of the member from Gold Bar. And as the government House Leader, understanding how debate takes place in this House, for him to take a portion of that quote and attempt to tell Albertans that the member has said parks are not for sale, it's not credulous. I think it's beneath the level of debate we should be striving for in this House than to twist someone else's words using only a partial quote. And given previous rulings in this House and your serious concern around the use of whether someone is or is not misleading this House, to see this action taken by the government House Leader to use a portion of a quote when it is very clear that the intent from the member from Gold Bar was to clearly show that this government has put up all of the facilities and all of the lands at these specific parks up for sale. It is under that 23 H and I that we rise on this point of order. We ask that the government House Leader apologize and withdraw.
Government House Leader.
Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, to be clear for the record, there is no land and or parks for sale inside this province, Mr. Speaker. Again, unfortunate to continue to see the misleading inside this chamber, Mr. Speaker, and a little bit rich for the honourable member to accuse me or anybody else in this chamber of misleading this House when her member and her caucus continue to mislead Albertans on a daily basis on this issue. Having said that, this is clearly a matter of debate, Mr. Speaker. No, I did not quote the entire member's speech into the record in a timed question period, Mr. Speaker. I was asked by my honourable colleague whether in regards to parks being for sale and his concerns with the fact that the NDP continue to make things up in that regards, and I used this exact quote from these exact words from the honourable member on June 9, 2020 at 19:30, which, Mr. Speaker, is clearly in Hansard. I said, I just want to clarify, though, and I'm quoting him, one thing that the member said about the fact that parks aren't for sale, period. I just want to say that I agree with the Minister of Transportation when he says that parks aren't for sale, Mr. Speaker. The question was about parks, and I referred to the honourable member's comments in regards to parks.
Thank you for both of your submissions. I would just provide a small caution to the Honourable the Government House Leader in referring to who or what organizations may or may not be misleading this House during his point of order. It sounded a lot to me like he may have said that this member and members of the NDP are misleading the House. The implication that the honourable member for Edmonton Millwoods would be misleading the House would certainly have been a point of order if it was made during any other time. I hear you say you're happy to withdraw it. I'm happy to have that. I can only imagine you just went to refer to the opposition. With respect to the substance of the point of order, I do agree with the Honourable the Government House Leader that this is a matter of debate and a continuation of the debate that did take place in the House on June 9th, 2020. At any given time, members of both sides of the House will use portions of Hansard to prove a point or disprove a point, and I don't believe that there is any point of order, with exception to the point that's already been withdrawn by the Honourable Government House Leader. As such, I consider this matter dealt with and concluded. And prior to moving to orders of the day, I would just like to mention to honourable members that earlier this afternoon, my office sent out a memo that provided some context about the additional opening of our legislature as we move into phase 2 of the Alberta government's relaunch. I provided some additional comments with respect to visitors. I encourage you to review that memo, as you would, there are a number of protocols there that you will be required to follow. Honourable members, we are at orders of the day, orders du jour.
Committee of the Whole.
Committee of the Whole to order. Committee of the Whole has under consideration Bill 4, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020. Are there any members wishing to speak to the bill? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate the
Apologies. Before you start, Honourable Member, I just want to remind the House we are on Amendment A1.
Chair, Amendment A1, proposing that indeed the bill move from a fixed budget period to a fixed budget date, that being set on the third Thursday of each February. So I appreciate the opportunity to rise and speak to Amendment A1 on Bill 4. The Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act, a fixed budget period. Of course, though, we are debating an amendment which would perhaps suggest then that that would be a change to the title. So perhaps that's a further amendment we need to bring later, depending on how members should receive this particular amendment. That would then become perhaps the Fixed Budget Date Amendment Act. We will see how that may proceed. Now, what we have in this particular bill, on which we are considering moving from a budget period to a budget date, is legislation currently establishes a range of 28 possible dates during which the budget could be set. Now, I would note that although this government very much likes to invoke the McKinnon report in many of the decisions it's making that apply to other people, certainly, Madam Chair, in this particular case, they seem to have decided that a particular recommendation of that panel should not apply to them. I'm sure there are many in the healthcare system that would wish the government would give them the same latitude in considering how elements of that report would impact them. But in this particular bill, we see that the government is ignoring the recommendation of the McKinnon report that it set a fixed budget date, as we see is done in the province of BC, and indeed on many occasions this government and members of it, and indeed ministers of it, and indeed my own counterpart, the Minister for Health, has often praised decisions of the BC government to justify many of the steps that he has chosen to take, or to misrepresent sometimes, I think, elements of what the BC government has done to justify things here. But that aside, the BC government is one that has set a fixed budget date. And again, that was a recommendation of the McKinnon panel report, and one which this government has chosen to ignore by instead giving itself a range of 28 possible dates on which it could set a budget. So in that sense, one could say this is somewhat weak legislation. So that is why we have this amendment in front of us here today, because we are always happy to try to be helpful in the official opposition, Madam Chair, to help the government to achieve the goals it is set out for itself. And in this case, since it has said many times that the McKinnon panel report is indeed the template for the work it needs to do and the work that is necessary to do on behalf of Albertans, we're more than happy in this instance to help them comply with that report more fully and set a precise fixed budget date. Now, of course, again, this amendment is proposing that that be the third Thursday of February. Now, of course, it's if the government would like to propose a different fixed budget date to comply with the McKinnon report, certainly we could perhaps have a sub-amendment to this amendment, or we could have an opportunity for that discussion here, and we could take a look at that. But at this point, what we are proposing is that we move forward with a fixed budget date of the third Thursday in February. Now, certainly, this decision of the UCP is one that sort of falls amongst many that they've made of late. You know, the decision to exploit a federal loophole to take federal tax dollars to pay for their political staff. Certainly, so this decision to ignore that recommendation of the McKinnon report is not quite as bad as that decision. But it is still a problematic one, because really all this bill is doing is suggesting a budget window so that Albertans will know the month of the year when this government will continue its agenda of, well, I guess moving forward the budget. Certainly what we saw with this last budget was certainly not much in the way of transparency. Now, certainly it is a step towards transparency, I suppose, to offer a fixed budget window, much as we have a fixed election window. That's better, I suppose. But indeed, what we saw, even with this last budget, is that this government indeed did not want any scrutiny or transparency around its budget. So while we consider having a fixed budget date or a fixed budget window, I think it's worth recognizing that this government, in fact, chose to use extraordinary powers of this House to force their budget through in a record amount of time. They said under cover of the COVID pandemic, but indeed they were more than happy to proceed then with several non-essential pieces nearly immediately afterwards. So that's certainly concerning, because whether we have a budget window or we have a fixed budget date, which is what we are discussing right now here on this amendment, such behavior by a government certainly indicates that regardless of, even if we do manage to fix that date, I think Albertans will still have good reason to be very concerned about this government's commitment towards transparency. Now, certainly I look forward to the upcoming fiscal update, which we will see from the Minister of Finance. And of course, generally with those fiscal updates, those take place within a period of time. To the best of my knowledge, they don't have fixed dates, but they are required, I believe, by a certain point. And so I look forward to that, and certainly look forward to the government hopefully being far more transparent about the path they are currently rocketing along towards $20 billion of debt. Indeed, a far higher deficit than our government ever saw. But recognizing that, of course, there were important steps that needed to protect Albertans against COVID-19, and of course this government choosing to force through the budget, which we are talking about here, whether or not in the future such a budget would take place on a fixed budget date, or whether it would take place within a fixed period, a period of 28 days. So that such a budget, as in this case, that was forced through and really did not take into account the very real fiscal realities we know this government was staring down. And indeed, being based on what they themselves knew were absolutely, utterly gutted projections, utterly unrealistic. Indeed, the Minister of Finance having noted that he felt Rome was burning down around him when he brought it forward in February. Of course, in this case, we had not yet had a legislation like this, which would allow us to consider whether we should be, as on the amendment, on a fixed budget date or a budget window. So the minister had the opportunity to decide when he would bring forward this budget, which then almost immediately became irrelevant, and which his government then chose not to bother updating, but instead to ramrod through this House with barely any scrutiny, canceling even opportunities they already had in place to proceed with the estimates. Now, of course, this bill that we have in front of us to set either a fixed budget window, or as we are suggesting with Amendment A1, which is in front of us, to have a fixed budget date, would not amend such behavior by government. Certainly government would still be free to, under this bill, would still be free to abuse the power that it has to force the opposition into a position where we do barely have an opportunity to debate. They could still do that under this bill or under this amendment moving towards a fixed budget date. They could still choose to absolutely limit and gut the estimates process that Albertans rely on to give the opposition the opportunity to do their job on behalf of Albertans, which would still take place, government allowing, under a budget window or a fixed budget date. Unfortunately, the government is still allowing themselves that power to move in such a way that is, I think, an embarrassment to Albertans and falls far short of the standards that Albertans would expect governments to keep, whether or not they were working with a budget window or, as in Amendment A1, as we're discussing here, a fixed budget date. So when we are talking about a bill that is indeed entitled the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Act, And while we are considering whether that should incorporate a budget window or, as in Amendment A1, a fixed budget date, I think it's incredibly important to consider just in what ways government is choosing or not choosing to, in fact, be demonstrating good fiscal planning, or indeed transparency. So my concern is I don't understand why this particular element of the McKinnon report, which again has served as, for lack of a better metaphor at the moment, the Bible of the UCP's plan so far, of this government's intentions for the province of Alberta, why this one particular piece? Because they are more than happy to use that document to put all kinds of constraints on every other part of Alberta, Madam Chair. They have been more than happy to quote that document to attack doctors in our province. Indeed, just the other day, the Minister of Health had a good deal to say about how he was going to ensure transparency from the Alberta Medical Association and how important it was that Albertans know precisely what every doctor in this province is being paid. But yet that minister is part of a government which has tried to duck transparency and indeed in this bill is choosing to ignore the recommendation from their own panel on financial prudence in this province, that being in having a budget window of 28 days as opposed to what we are proposing here in Amendment A1, that being a fixed budget date, that being the third Thursday of each February. So again, this is a government that is more than happy to enforce all kinds of stringencies on other folks within this province, as much as they may talk about autonomy and freedom, Madam Chair. And in this case, want to allow themselves the freedom of 28 days as opposed to a fixed budget date, which we are proposing in Amendment A1. They are more than happy to tell school boards what they should or should not do with their reserves. They are more than happy to tell municipalities what they should or should not do. They are more than happy to grasp and interfere and insinuate their way into every level of governance in this province in the name of the McKinnon report, and sometimes just in plain old ideology, in ways that they did not outline in their election platform, and in ways that are not mentioned in the McKinnon report, and indeed in ways that I have heard no Albertans say that they have asked this government to behave. But in this one instance where we have this recommendation clearly related to Bill 4 and the budget window of 28 days, which this government is proposing for itself, and what we are suggesting should be amended to actually reflect what the report actually said to the government, that being a fixed budget date on the third Thursday of February each year. But again, what we have seen continually, Madam Chair, unfortunately, is whether or not there is a fixed date for the budget, we have a government that is quite loose with the facts, shall we say, when it comes to how their budgets are actually operating. Indeed, we have heard the repeated denials from the Minister of Education regarding the education budget, which is part of what we are discussing here as we discuss whether or not we should have a 28-day budget window under which that education budget would be brought forward as opposed to a fixed budget date as we're proposing in Amendment A1. That education budget, of course, we continually hear has no cuts in it, but we know the effects that is having on the ground. That education budget brought forward under a budget, as it would be in the future, within either a 28-day budget window in this bill, or instead, as we are proposing under Amendment A1, a fixed budget date. But what we have seen instead is a complex shell game attempting to hide from Albertans the depth of the cuts, which we continually hear from parents, and are continuing to hear from parents and school boards and everyone else aside from members of this government, the minister and her staff. And I can only imagine that under a future budget, which under this bill, if the government had its current way, would be within a 28-day budget window, and which we are proposing through Amendment A1, should be a fixed budget date of the third Thursday in February. That in the future, we are going to see more of the same. So given that is the choice of this government, to continually display this kind of bad faith to Albertans, and frankly, every single organization so far which provides services to Albertans. And indeed, we have seen the effect that is having, I think, on the credibility of the government. You would think this could give one opportunity to make this one change, to show perhaps Albertans give them a little more reason to maybe give a little bit of trust back to a government which has continually made cuts and then said they did not make a cut, even though Albertans can clearly see the cut is there, and your school board will tell you the cut is there, and indeed your frontline doctor will tell you that the cuts are there and in fact are affecting the services. And as we see doctors leaving communities and we see patients having issues with being able to find a doctor, we know what the reality is, despite what the government might say. Here's an opportunity for them to at least demonstrate they will offer a little bit of good faith to Albertans by adopting a fixed budget date. That would be one thing that Albertans would know for sure. They could trust that this government would do when they said they would do it, despite the fact that there have been so many elements on which they've discovered they cannot. Indeed, the budget coming either in a 28-day window, as proposed by the legislation, or as we are proposing in Amendment A1, to be on a fixed budget date, that being the third Thursday of February, third February of Thursday, perhaps in an alternate universe. But recognizing this would provide that little bit of faith back to Albertans. Indeed, perhaps Albertans like those who serve in our big cities, in Edmonton and Calgary, who saw the big city charter, which this government had promised in their election campaign that they would in fact keep, but broke faith and tore up in the past fall. Indeed, in the first budget, which would not have been affected necessarily by this legislation as it fell outside of the window, the 28-day window which this legislation would propose for a normal budget year. Or if the government were to adopt Amendment A1, which we are currently bringing forward, which would move that to a fixed budget day, that being the third Thursday of February. Of course, that budget in the fall, which eliminated the big city charter, which the government campaigned on the fact that they were in fact going to keep. And so we're utterly disingenuous with Albertans and indeed our big cities on that. So that particular budget would not have been affected by this legislation. Now, we can look a little bit closer at it and we can sort of wonder, well, does this government actually really have the intent of keeping good faith with Albertans in terms of its future fiscal plans or announcements or budgets? There's not really anything in this bill, not really any incentives or sanctions to ensure that Cabinet actually abides by either this range of dates which they currently propose in the bill, that being 28 days, or instead moving to a fixed budget date, that being as we are proposing, the third Thursday of February. To the best of my knowledge, there would be no specific penalties should the Cabinet choose not to follow through on that. And as I have discussed and could certainly continue to discuss at great length, Madam Chair, this is a Cabinet that has already demonstrated that it lacks good faith in many respects with Albertans. It's willing to take a number of gambles and a number of steps, including on many things that it promised it would not do and then has chosen to do. So Albertans have good reason to ask why such a government, when they have had such an experience with it already, thinks that they would be okay with simply saying, yeah, we'll trust you on that one. I can tell you, Madam Chair, the emails that I get in my inbox as the critic for health, there are very few people in this province that trust this government on health care right now, that's for sure. And certainly in the ongoing battle we see between this government and doctors, far more Albertans seem to trust their family doctor than this government. Whether or not the members of the government would choose to actually believe their family doctors and those in their communities or not. But again, this is all part of our discussion of this bill which the government has brought forward, which is intended to restore some modicum of trust, or provide some modicum of accountability on the part of government. Indeed, that's right there in the title, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Amendment Act. And we will see, I suppose, Madam Chair, first of all, in whether the government chooses to accept the amendment that we have brought forward, Amendment A1, proposing a fixed budget date as recommended by the McKinnon panel, the panel which this government swears up and down all Albertans should accept as the blueprint for the future of our province. regardless of how much pain they may feel as part of that process, how much inconvenience, how many services they may lose, how many teachers may be fired, how many doctors may be driven out of the province, how many educational assistants are not there, however many special needs students are left without support, however many people on AISH are left with cuts, or how many people may be unable to access it, however many people are no longer able to access supportive housing after cuts by the government as part of their budget, which we are discussing when that budget would come in here as part of either a 28-day window or the fixed date set out in Amendment A1, being February, the third Thursday of February. So I suppose we will see if this decision by government to bring forward this one change, this one measure, will convince any more Albertans that they can have any trust in this government, or indeed any budget that they bring forward, as we have the Premier going about and talking about the great fiscal reckoning that is to come, except of course for himself and Mr. Knight-Legg in his office, who can enjoy the greatest of expenses. But when the Premier brings forward a budget under this bill, whether it will be in that 28-day period or whether it will be, if they accept the amendment, on a fixed budget date, that being the third Thursday of February. That great fiscal reckoning that the Premier talks about, that would take place under the steps, under the rules set out by this bill. We will see if this government is in fact willing to take a small amount of inconvenience on its own part, while it's so willing to foist so much more than inconvenience and real pain and suffering on Albertans and Albertan families as a result of their fiscal decisions. On this amendment, I suppose we will see whether this government is willing to take changes.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? No, we're in committee. You can just speak if you want.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll speak.
The Honourable Member for Peace River.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to respond to some of the concerns brought up by the member opposite from Edmonton Centre. He questioned, pardon me? City Centre, pardon me. Edmonton City Centre, thank you, Honourable Member. So he questions if there could be one thing that Albertans could know about the budget. Well, one thing Albertans do know is they don't trust the NDP to run the budget. We saw that very clearly in the last election. The motion, or the amendment put forward by the members opposite makes zero sense, Madam Chair. If we were to have, say, a pandemic during that third Thursday of February, what would happen, Madam Chair? It seems like they're just throwing anything at the wall, hoping that it sticks. I'm very glad, and my constituents as well are glad, that the members opposite are not governing during the pandemic right now, because if they were, we would end up in a spot, potentially, where we would have no money to spend. And this was the debate during the debate on the budget this last year. We were in a spot where we needed to spend dollars. We needed to be able to finance and fund our government programs. And had we done what the opposition suggested, the province would have run ashore. We wouldn't have been able to get any money to any of our programs. It makes no sense, Madam Chair. It sounds as though they're really just trying to be oppositional for oppositional's sake, and I understand that there's an interest in that in Parliament and legislature such as this to find a certain amount of friction so that we can have good debates and produce better legislation. But I ask you, Madam Chair, and I ask members opposite, and I ask my constituents, is this really making better legislation where they're just spinning their tires to try and fix us into one single day when there could be any number of disasters or circumstances yet thought of that bind us into a single fixed day for the budget rather than a period of 28 days? It seems eminently reasonable. Anyone I could speak to in my constituency would say, I see no idea why you'd pick one day for something like that when there's so much riding on it. Our entire government stops if that happens. And I appreciate very much how the members opposite care so deeply for our social programs, as do I and my constituents. It strikes me as the last thing they'd want is not to deliver those programs. It strikes me that the amendments they're bringing forward do exactly the opposite of everything they say publicly and criticize us for. So on that, I'm happy to take my seat and continue debate on the issue. But I'd implore members opposite to please go ahead and vote for this bill and against the amendment so that we can have a thoughtful way of approaching our budget going forward. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Glenora.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair and colleagues, for the opportunity engage on this matter for consideration today before the House. And I do want to say that you can vote for an amendment and vote for a bill. Voting for an amendment certainly doesn't preclude anyone from being able to vote for a bill. And let me take a trip down memory lane as to why this amendment is even being considered here today. One of the first things the government did after they were duly elected was appoint Dr. McKinnon to run a blue ribbon panel report and come up with a number of recommendations. Recommendation 25 in her report, which the Premier proudly stood beside her when she released on September 3rd, 2019, not even a year ago, was establish a fixed budget date. Full stop. She didn't say period. She didn't say season. She didn't say opportunity for several dates, 28 or even 29 once every 4 years. She said establish a fixed budget date. Couldn't be more clear. Date. There's not a lot of room to read between those words to interpret what the member opposite has just said. The rationale that the member opposite gives to having a date being, well, what if that date doesn't work because there's a global pandemic? The most recent global pandemic has lasted for longer than 28 days. But the government took an opportunity to ram through their budget on the eve of it. Their prerogative, if they chose to do so, I guess. But to put in a law that gives you so much flexibility outside of the direction that was given through this report that they said they're acting on implementing around having a fixed budget date, not a period, not a season, not a month, date. And I also want to remind us of the colleagues then in the Wild Rose who were very opposed to having a campaign season, as it was referred to in the legislation. There was a proposal to have a campaign, an election date, and then Premier Redford came out with a budget or a bill that said that there would be a campaign season. It could be any one date within sort of a 3-month period. And the outroar, rightfully so, from the members of the Wild Rose for the Premier of the day to ignore her own testament that there would be a date and then to later come forward with a season. So I guess it isn't a 3-month range. It is a 28 and a quarter date range that is being proposed here by the government, but it is absolutely contrary to what the McKinnon report recommended in recommendation 25 less than a year ago that they so proudly endorsed. So that's why my colleague, the member for Lethbridge West and the critic for finance, has moved the following amendment. I'm going to read it because, again, I know a lot of us are doing our best not to have too much paper on our desks. So for everyone's reflection, Bill 4, Fiscal Planning and Transparency Amendment Act 2020 be amended in Section 2 as follows. That the proposed section 4.1 sub 1 be struck out during, where it says, quote, during the month of February and substituting the third Thursday of every month in February. Very clearly a date that moves. Thursdays are often used. That's a nice day. Often governments want to drop the budget and then be able to go around during a constituency break, or at least during the constituency day and the weekend, to be able to promote their budget. We understand that. That's why we're suggesting that it be on a Thursday, which it often is on a Thursday. And we picked the third Thursday because it is a date. It doesn't seem like it's too early or too late. And again, complies with the recommendation 25 in the report. By striking out the proposed section 4.1 sub 2 and substituting the following, so substitute instead would read, if for the purpose of holding general election, the Legislative Assembly is dissolved at any time between August 31st and March 1st of the fiscal year, the responsible minister shall no later than 120 days on which the general election is held, table the Legislative Assembly the main estimates of the fiscal year that immediately follows the general election. So if there is a spring election during the time where this third Thursday falls, of course, you don't stop the election. If the election's called during that period of time, you have up to 120 days following that election to be able to present the budget. Again, not a hard date, but 120 days following the third Thursday, so it certainly would give a lot of opportunity in those occasional years, which according to law right now, let's hope that law gets followed. It did get followed in the last election, but it wasn't followed in the previous elections, even though it was brought in under Conservatives, that if there is an election, it should be during that season, in the spring, once every 4 years. So presumably it would fall during the third Thursday of February, once every 4 years. That's being taken into consideration in this amendment. Why are we adding that second piece? Well, I will say that when we were in the briefing on budget day and this bill was brought to us, as has been past practice, that bills be shared with the government. And actually, I don't actually think it was the bill. I think it was a briefing note, not the actual bill. But that the government and public service representatives share bills related to the budget with the opposition so that everyone can have a thorough understanding of what's in this. It's shared with the media and of course, parliamentary tradition and Beauchesne's would say that nothing could be shared with members outside of this assembly before they're shared with members inside this assembly as it relates to legislation. So when this was brought forward, one of the questions that was asked is, what are the consequences if this isn't followed? And the government didn't put in any consequences if they break what is already a very loose period as opposed to a date. There were no consequences or ramifications for the government should they choose to do that. So, okay, presumably they will probably do it occasionally once every 4 years. So then build that flexibility in through an actual amendment in the legislation rather than making a law that you know highly likely the government will not enforce. I think that government should be law-abiding. They should follow the laws of the land, whether there are laws that were in place before them or whether they were laws that they made. So to make a law and clearly not have checks and balances in for it. And when we said, well, why isn't that? The reason that was given was, well, once every 4 years-ish, you know, there could be a spring election. So we would need the flexibility to not have the budget in February if that were the case. Well, then build it into the bill. Don't give yourself a parachute to hold yourself less accountable than what you're pretending to be accountable for in the bill that you're presenting. So we're trying to simply build in that flexibility that we know was already on the mind of senior staff in the finance minister's office into the bill, rather than the government coming here, passing a bill that they have no intention of actually respecting or upholding. So that's the two parts to the amendment. So the first part is to actually follow the recommendation that the Premier so proudly stood beside the report author and said he was very excited to have this report and he was going to be working to implement it. Actually do it. Pick a date. If you don't like the third Thursday, pick another date. But please respect your own recommendations, respect values that have been in place in other provinces in this country and that have been able to be upheld. Pick a date. That's what the recommendation was. Please consider doing that by passing this amendment, I would say. Or if you have a different date, feel free to bring forward a different date. But please don't play games with Albertans and try to continue to misrepresent facts on this matter. And then number two, of course, was the piece around acknowledging that there could very well be elections in the spring. So rather than passing laws that you have no intention of actually respecting or upholding or abiding by, make laws that you're already thinking through the various scenarios. That's why you didn't put any consequences in here for failing to follow the law. Whereas when we pass other laws, whether they be laws around OH&S, we have consequences if people break those laws. If there are laws around speeding on highways, we have consequences if you break those laws. If it's good for the goose, it should be good for the government. And I think that that's why the government should be enthusiastically accepting this amendment. And again, you can accept this amendment and still support the bill. It just makes it better. It makes it something that flows from the recommendation report and acknowledges that there could very well be elections in the spring. And I would say it respects the values that were argued for so fiercely by members of the Wild Rose when Premier Redford was in office and called for an election season. I think a lot of folks here probably remember how appalled they and many others were by that disrespectful attempt to pretend that there was something that was happening around a specific date when there clearly wasn't. And that's exactly what's happening in this bill. So this is an opportunity to take a bill and make it a bit better. And as private members, we have the opportunity to raise our voices and our votes to do so. And I encourage all of my colleagues to do that here momentarily. Thank you very much.
Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment A1? The Honourable Member for Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche.
Thank you. Well, I appreciate so much the content and the motive behind this. I have to only think back to March. On March 1st of this year, our government had certain ideas and plans and a budget and a schedule in place and a calendar, and by March 17th, our entire world had upended. We had a public state of emergency called in the province of Alberta, and that wasn't something that I think was even on our docket of being a reality. And so while I appreciate the idea of having a fixed date, that binds us to one particular date. And in my riding of Fort McMurray-Lac-La-Biche, I have the fortunate / unfortunate circumstance of having a riding that's had multiple natural disasters and different states of local emergency called. And I would hate that a government would be saddled into a particular date, even if something were happening outside our control. And so I just have to think to 3 weeks ago, the floods in Fort McMurray and the Fort Vermilion area, to think of having one particular date and having it in legislation that it is one particular date that we can bring forward the budget, doesn't necessarily put into account the realities that we are a province that is immovable and has a variety of changes happening on a regular basis. Furthermore, I would almost question, my memory isn't 100%, but my recollection is that when you guys were part of the government, when the official opposition was in the government, not once was a budget tabled before March 31st. I could very well be wrong, and I would love to be corrected if I am wrong. But I believe that that's something that's worth pointing out. And so having the fixed month for the election, I think, is achieving that right balance of having that 28-day period. And with that, thank you, Ms. Chair.
And the members wishing to speak to Amendment A1 on Bill 4. Seeing none, I will call the question on Amendment A1. All those in favor of Amendment A1, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. So carried. The amendment has been defeated. We are back on the main bill. Are there any members wishing to speak to the debate on Bill 4? Seeing none, shall I call the question on Bill 4? All right. On Bill 4, the Fiscal Planning and Transparency Fixed Budget Period Amendment Act 2020. On the clauses of the bill, are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. On the title and preamble, are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. Shall the bill be reported? Are you agreed? Any opposed? Carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Chair, I move that we rise and report Bill 4.
Having heard the motion to rise and report on Bill 4, all those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried. We shall now rise and report. Good mark. The Honourable Member for Drayton Valley, Devon.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The Committee of the Whole has under consideration certain bills. The committee reports the following bill, Bill 4. Madam Speaker, I wish to table the copies of all amendments considered by the Committee of the Whole on this date for the official records of the Assembly.
Does the Assembly concur in the report? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. So carried.
Under Government Bills and Orders for second reading, Bill 17, Mental Health Amendment Act 2020. Adjourned debate on amendment. Member Irwin.
The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, I do believe that if you seek it, you will find unanimous consent to go to 1-minute bells for the remainder of the afternoon.
Having heard the motion, unanimous motion to move to 1-minute bells, is anyone opposed? Please say so now. So granted. We are at 1-minute bells. Are there any members wishing to speak to the bill? The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I'm pleased to rise to speak again to Bill 17, Mental Health Amendment Act, and to speak to, I believe, Madam Speaker, we are on an amendment of referral to the Standing Committee on Family and Communities. Can I confirm that?
That's correct.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I speak in support of that amendment, that this bill be referred to the Committee on Families and Community because this is a significant piece of legislation that has an impact not only generally on Albertans with respect to mental health issues, but also on a number of specific medical professionals or health professionals, I should say, who would be affected by the implications of this act. So I want to begin with a little bit of background, and I had an opportunity, Madam Speaker, to speak to Bill 17 earlier in second reading and posed a number of questions, and the Minister of Health was able to respond to some of those questions, which I appreciate. I will say that it still raises a number of questions about the content of this. So as an overview, of course, Madam Speaker, as you know, Bill 17 is an amendment to the existing Mental Health Act, and there are a number of changes that, while the Minister of Health indicated were not directly in response to a court decision that was made last year in July 2019, which is titled JH versus Alberta Health Services, it is certainly a driving force, I think, behind the changes that we see right now proposed in Bill 17. And in particular, I want to talk a little bit about that court case because it very significantly sort of drives the, I believe, the motivation and the implementation of the changes in Bill 17. So for those who may not be aware, just the decision in JH versus AHS was around a matter that was brought before the courts as a result of an individual who is not named for confidentiality purposes, even within the court decision. But JH, as he's referred to in the decision, was a 49-year-old man, First Nations man from BC, who was living in Alberta and who had suffered a brain injury, and then as a result of a number of different circumstances found himself homeless, was brought in to Foothills Medical Centre in Calgary as a result of behavior and concerns about his mental health. And this was, I believe, in September of 2014. And this man, JH, was reviewed and assessed by a medical professional at the center, and an admission certificate was issued, a Form 1 admission certificate as it's known, which basically detained somewhat against the will of JH, which there's the authority to do under the Mental Health Act, detained that individual for, I think it was almost 8 months, and there was a number of renewal certificates that were issued, which basically meant that there was concern that as a result of mental health conditions, this man was held against his will and detained and received medical treatment. Now, we don't take this lightly in this country. Of course, we believe our bodily integrity is primary. It's essential. That nobody should be able to interfere and detain us and deliver treatment without consent. We believe that's very important in our country for good reason. We do understand, of course, that there are circumstances where individuals may, as a result of mental health conditions or various other, not only mental health conditions, but maybe in a state where they're not able to make decisions with true autonomy about their health. But we must be very careful, of course, about when we either provide medical treatment against the consent or will of an individual or detain somebody as a result of that. Now, the decision is quite long, Madam Speaker, and this is a decision that was issued in July 2019. But it's important because it's the process by which the gentleman, in this case, JH, was detained, was reviewed. And there was a significant number of issues that were identified throughout the process by which these admission certificates were administered and renewed, and the right of this individual to understand his appeal rights, because there is appeal rights under the Mental Health Act, and to appeal the certificates that were issued, and the process by which that appeal process and review process was handled were under consideration in this decision. And there was quite a, as I indicated, a long decision issued by the courts. And what's specific is that, for our consideration here today, of course, is that the court ultimately struck down a number of provisions of the existing Mental Health Act, and in particular struck those down on the basis that they were unconstitutional, and that, in fact, that the process by which this individual in particular was held and detained and received treatment was actually contrary to Section 7 of the Charter, which is the rights to liberty, to life and liberty and self-determination, Sections 9 about arbitrary detention, and Sections 10 about the right to have appropriate legal counsel. And the court was quite clear that the process that exists in the highlighted sections of the Mental Health Act were unconstitutional. And they directed, in its decision, the court directed the government to basically amend these sections within 1 year. In the event that they were not amended, these provisions are struck down. They're of no force and effect. So the government, basically, of Alberta had a year to bring forward either amending legislation or to decide not to amend the Mental Health Act and to basically let those provisions be struck down and no longer exist. So I understand that the Minister of Health indicated in his comments earlier in second reading on this bill that while that court decision was a factor, it was not the only factor as to why this bill was brought forward today. But certainly it had to be a motivating factor, because we are sitting here, we are in June of 2020, in a month, these provisions would essentially be struck down. So that does lead to some urgency, to some effect, to some intent to actually bring this legislation forward. Now, because of that timeline that we don't usually see with legislation, where there's actually a court-imposed timeline by which legislation must be brought forward, I can appreciate that there was some urgency, perhaps, in how this bill was prepared, and potentially the possibility, and we believe that might be the case, that there wasn't the fulsome opportunity required to actually consult or speak with affected stakeholders. Now, I think I'd like to talk a little bit, Madam Speaker, about the fact that what is presented here in Bill 17, the Mental Health Amendment Act, is not, I guess, word for word responsive to the direction of the court, which outlined a number of sections specifically that were struck down. For example, the ruling in JH versus AHS struck down these specific sections of the Mental Health Act: Section 2, which is the admission certificate provision; Section 4, subsection 1; Section 4, subsection 2, which talks about the effect of one admission certificate in the Mental Health Act; Section 7, subsection 1, which talks about the effect of 2 admission certificates; and then Section 8, subsection 1, and Section 8, subsection 3 of the Mental Health Act, which deals with renewal certificates. So those were the specific provisions, Madam Speaker, that were struck down and are of no force and effect. I raised this question earlier in Second Amendment because it is a bit of a complicated situation. We have an existing act, we have a court decision which strikes down certain sections, we have a bill that's being introduced that amends only some of the sections that were struck down, but not others. And in the background, I think, Madam Speaker, we also need to keep in mind that there's also an appeal of the decision in JH versus AHS. So even for somebody like myself, who has legal training and quite enjoy sort of the puzzle piecing of that work of looking at the existing act and looking at the ruling and the bill and piecing that all together, there is still great consideration that needs to be given to make sure that what is being brought forward in Bill 17 actually responds to the concerns raised by the court and actually struck down by the court in JH versus AHS. I note that the Minister of Health did respond to that concern and said, when I asked the question of, well, why does Bill 17 only address certain provisions that were outlined by the court as being unconstitutional and not affect other sections? And the minister rose and said, well, that's because there's alternate changes. There's changes throughout Bill 17 that that do address the court's concern. And I believe that that probably is the intention, but I think we certainly need some time to determine whether or not that's actually the case, because we have a situation where we have certain sections struck down, some have been amended, some have not, some will still be existing currently in the Mental Health Act, but will be struck down once the ruling has been 12 months has expired, and then we have additional changes to other sections of the Act which are intended, according to the Minister of Health, to address the direction of the court, but we haven't yet determined whether or not that's actually the case, and I don't think stakeholders have had the opportunity to do that. And most importantly, it seems to be that perhaps one of the most overall comprehensive changes that's made in this bill is, and it may be intended to address some of the concerns raised by the court in this decision, is to allow for qualified health professionals to be involved in the assessment and the issuance of admission certificates. And during our discussion earlier in Bill 2, the Minister and I had a little discussion about, I'll call it a discussion, of course, in the way we debate in this House, it doesn't really work out exactly like that, but I outlined, for example, that in Bill 17, the definition of qualified health professional is quite broad, that it includes a physician and nurse practitioner, as well as all health professions that are currently governed under Section 33, Sub 1, Sub A of the Health Professions Act. But as the Minister of Health noted, the regulations to the Mental Health Act may be created which designate which of those health professions might actually be permitted to be, or would be included, I should say, as one of those health professions that's able to issue an admission certificate under the Act. We don't know yet what health professions those will be, or will be designated by regulation. The Minister, I believe in his discussion about this bill, has referred substantially to nurse practitioners as being an additional category of health professional beyond physicians who are able to be involved in the issuance of admission certificates. But certainly the scope of what's set out in Bill 17 is much broader than that. It doesn't limit it to just nurse practitioners, which of course the Minister and the drafters of the bill would very well be able to do if that was the only health professional that they wanted to provide this additional responsibility to issue these admission certificates. They certainly could have limited within the bill to just nurse practitioners, but it's not. It's quite broad, and we don't know yet what those regulations would look like and which other health professions would be involved in now issuing admission certificates, which I want to highlight once again the significance of admission certificates, because it is actually a health professional making a determination that somebody may be held against their will as a result of mental health issues in a medical facility. And so we, I think, need to have a fulsome discussion about which health professionals would be permitted or would be qualified to do that kind of work, especially because as it stands now, it's not that, for example, a health professional has to work in conjunction with a physician. It doesn't say that. It certainly right now, the way Bill 17 is drafted, any one qualified health professional could make that determination. And so, for example, and I take the Minister at his word that he certainly does not mean to include all health professionals listed under Section 33(1)A, because that would seem quite, I think we would all agree, absurd, for example, that a pharmacy technician, for example, which is a health profession that is governed by the Health Professions Act, would be able to single-handedly, without consultation, be able to issue an admission certificate to detain somebody on mental health grounds against their will. That certainly would not be what anybody would suggest. We certainly would not think that a naturopath, I would imagine, would be granted that kind of significant authority. or a dietitian or a denturist. I assume, I give these examples because right now what's drafted in Bill 17 as the definition of qualified health professional is incredibly broad. And I cannot foresee a situation where the government would suggest that any of these kinds of health professionals would be qualified to do this kind of work. But we do then need to know which health professionals are intended to be captured by this. I would imagine it's intended, of course, to include physicians and nurse practitioners as outlined here. I would imagine psychologists and psychiatrists would also be included, but right now the bill doesn't say that. And I'd also like to know, and which is the basis of why this amendment is brought forward today, that we should be referring this to the Committee on Families and Communities, is to have that discussion.
Honourable Member, Standing Order 29-2A is available. The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I was enjoying and appreciating the perspective my colleague from Edmonton Whitemud was bringing on the bill. I would hope that she might take a bit of time to wrap up those thoughts.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Whitemud.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and thank you to my colleague, the member from Edmonton City Centre. Yes, and so as I was mentioning, Madam Speaker, because of the category, the broadened category of individuals who would be involved now in the issuance of these admission certificates, I think we need to hear from those professional bodies, from those regulated authorities, and those professionals about what their thoughts are on their role within this. Do they believe they should have this authority? And I wonder, in light of the greater decision of the court, which was very clear about how carefully we must respect the constitutional rights of individuals who are being detained under the Mental Health Act. Does a broader scope of health professional increase or decrease the risk of somebody being detained contrary to their rights under the Mental Health Act? I don't know the answer to that question because I'm not a health professional. But I certainly think that the clear direction, which is the impetus of this bill from the court, is that we need to be very careful before we are subscribing or prescribing or limiting the rights of the autonomous rights of individuals to make decisions about the health treatment they receive and how they receive it without making, we must be very cautious to make sure that we do that carefully and with full respect of the rights of those individuals. And I hear that, I believe that the bill, I see that there are other sections that are meant to address some of the procedural rights that might have been lacking in the earlier Mental Health Act, and I commend those changes. But I still am not certain, given the way they're drafted, that they're actually guaranteeing those rights, particularly for individuals who are very vulnerable. And what I'd also think would be a valuable perspective to find out is we have other models in place in other legislation where we do have security services or protective services that are issued, particularly in light of children, for example, children who are secured services. And we have processes, and we have an independent officer of the legislature in that circumstance, which is the Office of the Child and Youth Advocate. We do not have a similar independent office of the legislature like that when it comes to adults. But adults under mental health care might also be equally as vulnerable as some children. So what we do have the mental health advocate outlined in here, but that is very clearly not an independent office of the legislature. That is clearly, as we speak right now, Madam Speaker, that's actually a political appointment. So before we bestow significant rights on an individual like that who doesn't have that independence, I think we need to evaluate and look at other circumstances before we are making a process that significantly affects the life and liberty of individuals with mental health conditions. So, Madam Speaker, I believe that there is enough significant impact here that we need to hear from health professionals that might be now involved in issuing these admission certificates, and to hear and evaluate other processes where independent advocates can certainly act on behalf of individuals' rights whose rights might be subscribed. So, for those reasons, Madam Speaker, I'm fully in support of this amendment to refer this bill for further consideration, for opportunity for input and consultation with stakeholders at the Committee for Families and Communities. So thank you, Madam Speaker.
Any other members wishing to speak under Standing Order 29-2A? Any other members wishing to speak to the amendment? The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. It's my pleasure to rise and speak to the referral amendment, and I too, like my colleague, absolutely support this amendment to send this legislation to Committee to Families and Communities so that some additional time and energy can be spent on this bill. And, as my colleague said, and I certainly appreciate her legal experience, as quite a bit of this is very complex. But I do think this particular piece of legislation, well, like all pieces of legislation, honestly, is vitally important, and any of the changes that we make have the potential to impact people's lives in a way that we can't possibly imagine in this place sometimes. But I just wanted to add to my colleague's comments. And when we first started debating this bill, one of my questions to the Minister of Health was around precisely the thing my colleague talked about, and that was on page 2, and it was talked about qualified health professional, means a physician or nurse practitioner or a person who's registered under Section 33(1)(a) of the Health Professions Act as a member of the health profession or of a category within the health profession designated by the regulation for the purposes of all or part of this act. And so certainly looks like someone's making a donation to their favorite charity. Oh, my favorite charity. Well, I've got lots. So pick one. They're all great. I just wanted to add a little bit about, I knew that there are a number of colleges in Alberta that would apply, but I actually was curious about the entire list to really understand who is impacted. And I do think that a referral amendment to families and communities would allow a thorough discussion. Certainly nurse practitioners are incredibly educated and experienced, and I have no doubt could contribute a great deal to this process. But there are also some other professions, I believe, that potentially could be included in this. Again, that's not for me to make that decision. It is for other folks, professionals in this field. But I wanted to give the Chamber a sense of the details of the list. So in the regulation, so the regulated health professions and colleges lists a number of them. My colleague mentioned some. So this includes dental hygienists, technologists, dentists, denturists, dietitians, hearing aid practitioners, LPNs, medical diagnostic therapeutic technologists, midwives, naturopaths, OTs, opticians, optometrists, paramedics, pharmacists, pharmacy techs, physiotherapists, and so on and so on. You can imagine includes psychologists, obviously, social workers, speech language pathologists, respiratory techs. And so, certainly there are some that we can probably envision that wouldn't necessarily, their field of expertise or their scope of work would not qualify them to weigh in on this matter, but there are some that likely could. And I think, once again, I understand that the legislation sort of opens the door and then to the creation of regulation, but I do think something this important is worth taking the time. I understand that the government is likely facing some time constraints given the court case that my colleague mentioned earlier, but I would encourage members of this assembly to do just that. Sadly, over the year that we've been here debating, I don't believe, maybe I'm wrong, you can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe any of the government bills have actually taken time to go to committee to be thoroughly looked at. And maybe that's something that all governments in general, believe. I think we all like to believe that we get it right the first time and we don't make mistakes, but maybe it's time for people to understand that, getting input before you pass something, before it becomes law, before it changes and has the potential to impact people's lives, it's worthy of having another look. Some of the other things that I mentioned when we talked about this bill the last time, one of the things that I noted in the decision, and again, I am not a lawyer, and so reading this decision was challenging at times, but one of the things that the decision talks about, strangely enough, is the preamble to the bill. And what it said specifically, it talked about the fact that other Canadian jurisdictions have preambles or purposes or purpose clauses, and so I do think that there are a number of pieces of legislation that we've seen of late where there is a preamble, and what it really does is introduces, I guess, the scope of the bill or the position that the bill would like to take. So it actually, in the document about the case, and it is JH versus Alberta Health Services, is they actually talk about the value of having a preamble and then noting that other jurisdictions do that. So perhaps that's something to think about to give overall some direction to this piece of legislation. I also wanted to correct the record a little bit. And when I first spoke to this bill, I actually made a mistake and commended the Minister of Health for having for the mental health advocate for not being a partisan appointment like the health and the seniors advocate, and sadly I was incorrect about that. Same person. It actually is the very same person. So the mental health patient advocate is indeed Ms. Harrington, who was a political operative and an appointment by the UCP. This person is also responsible. She is the health advocate as well as the seniors advocate. And I think we probably understood the value of this role before COVID-19. I think that we are all now very aware of just how much work that we have to do, particularly as it relates to seniors and, of course, to mental health supports and to health overall. So I don't think, I am not questioning her particular skill set right now, because I actually don't know the woman. I've never looked at her skill set. What I am questioning is a partisan appointment. What I am questioning is collapsing 3 different positions into one, when I think we could all agree that these are important positions, and the workload is large. I mean, you can just look through their annual reports to see the scope of the work that each position entails, and it is huge. To give you a bit of a sense, the mental health patient advocate under the Mental Health Act actually was designed to help people who are detained in hospital under admission or renewal certificates, and people under community treatment orders. Their role is to investigate complaints, and they are supposed to act independently, obviously, of the health system. So as you can imagine, and their staffing complement is not huge, so I imagine the workload of this particular position is large. So again, I would question, I think that I would hope that any government would endeavor to be as transparent as possible, particularly in their appointments to positions like this. But that's one issue. The other issue, obviously, is the fact that this government has collapsed 3 separate positions and created one. And I think that we've all probably been there when you take on more and more work and more and more work and more responsibilities. Obviously, you have less time to pay specific attention to issues. And I think mental health and being a mental health advocate is definitely important. The other thing that I really wanted to talk about this piece of legislation was I continue to see throughout the legislation, and I'm really hoping that the minister will at some point answer these questions. I know that I brought it up the last time I spoke, and I tried to go through the legislation and then look at the original piece to understand why the difference, or what the difference was and why that was brought in. But there is a piece that's been added to a number of different sections. So for example, under admission certificate, when a qualified health professional examines a person and is of the opinion that the person is suffering from a mental disorder, is within reasonable time likely to cause harm, and all of those things that were originally in the legislation, there has been a point that's added, and it says that has the potential to benefit from treatment for the mental disorder. Certainly that makes sense. I don't believe any person would ever admit someone to treatment without believing that it would help. I don't believe that for one second. However, I think given the unknown nature of which profession will be involved in determining or making these decisions, I think it's incumbent on us to ask the questions. What does that mean? So what is the standard? What is the criteria? If there are indeed tools that are acceptable that will be used to measure those things, what are they? And so it was really my hope, and you see this phrase scattered throughout this legislation where it had not been before. Again, I am not assigning any malicious intent by any stretch to anybody. I would just like some clarification as to why that is. And if there is intent to further elaborate on this piece in regulation in terms of what tools will be used, How will that be measured? I would certainly be happy to hear that. The other thing I wanted to do before my time runs out is I wanted to, my colleague talked a lot about the information that's available, based the court case, and that was again JH and Alberta Health Services and Minister of Justice and Solicitor General of Alberta and Calgary Legal Guidance. And again, that this is likely the impetus for some of the decisions or the timing, I guess, of this particular bill. But I think for us non-lawyers, and I'm sure that the vast majority of us in this room are non-lawyers, it's actually, there are sections of this decision that are really important to read, and I think that underscore just the thoughtfulness that has gone into the decision to explain why the decision was reached and why the recommendations were made. And I think it's worth any member's time that is interested actually in understanding why these changes and more. And I would like to underline that, and more. So the things that this Amendment Act introduces are, I'm glad that that's being addressed, but there are more things that need to be done. And I'm not going to read from it, but I would just like to give you a little bit of flavor of this. So as my colleague mentioned, that this particular person, a 49-year-old person, a member of First Nation in British Columbia, who had, and I think this is really important, who had no history of mental illness, but as a result of an injury ended up in the healthcare system. But, and I mentioned this the last time I spoke, is that as a result of after treatment being released, and as I'm sure many people understand, the impact of a traumatic brain injury, that certainly changes your life from that point on. But once this person was released, whether it was job loss or whatever other issues came up, that this person ended up being homeless. And as you can imagine, once these things start to happen, I imagine things snowball and get worse. So after following this, so this person was put in, received treatment, and then again was kept for quite a long time, and then was found to not been able to obtain legal counsel who could help him challenge the certificates, nor was he aware of his other rights. But then it goes on further, and why I'm sort of highlighting this, it goes on to talk about the importance of a patient advocate. And going back to my comments about the mental health patient advocate, why it is so important to have someone in this position at the very least that has some experience in this field. At the very least that can, although it's not an independent officer, that at the very least that we can be assured, and by we I mean Albertans, that we can be assured that any decisions or any follow-up or any additional work that will be done will not be partisan in any way and will not be, tainted by any sort of allegiance to any government at all, that this person would be solely focused on what is right for Albertans. And I think even for the members opposite, you have to admit, had we been in government, had we collapsed 3 advocate offices and appointed a partisan person, someone, let's say, that was the executive director of our political party, if we would have pointed that person to these advocate offices, I'm pretty sure that you would have had some questions or you would have raised an eyebrow. I'm quite sure you would have.
I think it would have been more than that.
Yeah, I think it probably would have been quite a bit more than that. But sadly...
Through the chair.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. So some of the heckling is because they wouldn't have been qualified. Well, I'm not going to engage in this, but I do think what I am saying, and I said earlier that I'm not commenting on Ms. Harrington's qualifications because I don't know what they are. I don't actually find that funny at all. And so what I am saying is that the appearance
Honourable members, Standing Order 29-2A is available. The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think my colleague had a few thoughts left to share, and I would appreciate if she'd like to take advantage of the moment to complete those.
The Honourable Member for St. Albert.
Thank you. So, you know, it's unfortunate. I just really want Albertans to understand, and again, I am certainly not commenting on the qualifications of any advocates. What I am saying is sometimes the appearance of impropriety, it says something. And I think the thing that I'm most concerned about, actually, is that the enormity of the work assigned to the seniors advocate, the health advocate, and of course, the mental health patient advocate, these are enormous jobs, if you just take a few moments to look at their annual reports. Look at their recommendations. Look at the scope of the investigations that they do. I think you will begin to appreciate the enormity of the work. So collapsing these three offices and then having one person take on all of those roles, I would really like to hear from the government as what the rationale, other than saving money, I would like to hear the rationale from government. What is it that led you to believe? What is the data? What data did you use to make those decisions? What is it that led you to believe that it was in the best interest of Albertans to collapse three offices that had previously existed into one? I'm not even talking about the partisan appointment. I'm just talking about the workload and the enormity of responsibility of these three particular offices. So I am certainly hopeful that the Minister of Health at some point will come back or come back in general and answer some of the questions. I think that all of us in this House, and I've said this a number of times, I don't believe any of us try to get this job or run for this job or do this job to harm anybody. I think we actually all show up in this place in our own way to do what we can to make lives better for people. Now it's debatable sort of the journey that we take to get there, but I don't believe that any of us come here to cause harm to anybody. So I would like to know why these decisions are made, and if there is a rational explanation, if there is data to support it, if there is science to support it. You know, I am happy to support something that can be demonstrated to be the right thing to do. I actually am. But I would like to hear from the Minister of Health. There are a number of questions, particularly in this legislation, that have been outlined so far, and perhaps I'm not understanding something, or perhaps there's a plan to develop regulations around some of the issues that I've raised. I'm certainly open and happy to hear those explanations, so I will wait for that. So that being said, I'm going to take my seat and let my colleague continue. Thank you.
Any other members under Standing Order 29-2A? Seeing none. Any other members wishing to speak to REF 1? The Honourable Member for Edmonton City Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity to rise and speak to Bill 17, and indeed the referral we have in front of us, suggesting that this bill should be referred to committee for review. Now, I wanted to just follow on some of the comments from my honourable colleague from St. Albert. She was speaking of the expanded role of the mental health patient advocate. She was commenting that she did not want to speak to the qualifications of Ms. Harrington, the former executive director of the United Conservative Party, who was appointed to that role. I would note that while she has a number of qualifications, indeed, and I have no doubt that she is a capable person in many respects, I would note that she does not have any qualifications regarding health care or mental health care or experience in those fields. Now, particularly when we are talking about Bill 17, expanding the role of the mental health patient advocate to include an expanded legal responsibility to help people who've been detained in hospital or who are receiving mandatory treatment in the community. I think that's worth reflecting on. Now, certainly I know we have an incredibly capable public service. And indeed, I think for all of our ministers of the Crown, or indeed when we were in government, we are ministers of the Crown, they took great advantage of the opportunity that they have to work from the knowledge of our public service, in areas where we do not have an extensive area of knowledge. And indeed, I recognize that ministers of the Crown, indeed, themselves do not have to have vast experience in a particular area before they become responsible for it. But I would note, Madam Speaker, that there is some concern around the manner in which this particular individual who does not have that experience, as we talk about the reasons to refer this.
I hesitate to interrupt, but we are not on the path of the amendment in which we should be debating. Just a reminder that it's REF1. I will also express some caution when speaking about members that are not members in this assembly and certainly don't have the ability to speak for themselves. I know that that's not uncommon in this place, but I would be remiss if I didn't express some caution as we proceed with this debate in that regard. So please proceed on Amendment REF1 on Bill 17.
Certainly, Madam Speaker, I take your caution and will continue to debate about reasons why this bill should be sent for referral. And indeed, this bill, which adds additional powers to the mental health patient advocate, indeed, I think one of the reasons for referral is because what we have seen in this case, the individual we have serving as the mental health advocate, and this has nothing to do with this individual personally, but just noting the manner in which she was appointed, in that the health minister indeed had an open process in front of him. And again, I think this is reason why we should be considering referring this bill that is brought forward by that same health minister and involves that same individual who is the mental health advocate who is mentioned here and empowered in Bill 17. So a reason we should be making that referral is because that minister who brought forward this bill, which we are putting forward this amendment to refer, set aside an open process to look for an individual that indeed had the qualifications and perhaps would have had more knowledge under this provision in Bill 17 to provide this advice to individuals who are in a fairly serious situation when they are needing to reach out to the mental health advocate. So a reason why this bill should be referred is that that minister chose to set that entire process aside and simply appoint an individual who does not have specific knowledge or experience in a realm which is covered here under Bill 17, where individuals are facing possible admission, not by their choice. And in this case, the individual that is being empowered through this bill to have greater authority and responsibility in assisting that individual is someone that was chosen outside of due process, outside of a proper, open process where we could have considered all of the qualified individuals and people who might have had the specific knowledge already or experience in this field, and instead had a direct appointment by the Minister of Health who brought forward this bill, which we are suggesting should be referred to committee. His decision to appoint the former executive director of the United Conservative Party. I find that concerning, Madam Speaker. I think Albertans find that concerning. And it gives us pause to consider what this government's thoughts are in terms of how it is approaching things like this particular bill, which we are suggesting should be referred to committee. Because again, we have seen that this is a government which will make decisions which are not necessarily in the best interests of Albertans. And when we are dealing with a bill which has such serious impact on individuals in a very vulnerable situation that is in fact setting some of their personal rights to personal autonomy aside, Albertans want to know they can trust their government and that it is a government that is indeed being transparent and doing all of its due diligence and not, say, considering appointing someone, for example, simply because they would be helpful in covering over mistakes that government might make. Hypothetically speaking, Madam Chair, Madam Speaker. Now, returning to also discuss some other portions of the bill. Bill 17 also proposes to make some other changes. This bill also removes the sunset clause for the review of this legislation. This is another reason I think this bill should be referred, Madam Speaker. Now, I took part, and I believe you yourself may have taken part as a member of the Standing Committee for Families and Communities.
I hesitate to interrupt. The Speaker does not take part in any committees nor have an opinion on any matter in any way, shape, or form. which is what is relevant when I, as a member, am in this chair. Just for clarification, for the record, Honourable Member, please proceed.
Certainly, Madam Speaker. So a number of individuals who are still present in this chamber, when they were in opposition and are now sitting in government, took part along with me in a review of the Mental Health Act. And that was a review of the Mental Health Act that, as I recall, was mandated as part of the 5-year sunset clause within this bill. And indeed, that was a robust process. I found that incredibly educational. I did not know much about this particular area of the mental health, of the healthcare system. And indeed, it was highly educational in hearing from many people about their experiences in the system. Indeed, we heard from individuals who had been through the system. I recall receiving emails from people telling me about their experiences and their concerns and things they would like to see change. Having the opportunity to hear from, as I recall, law enforcement individuals who work with different agencies and supports folks from the legal community. When we are again talking about a piece of legislation, Madam Chair, which has such a profound effect on people's lives and indeed has the power to suspend some of their most personal rights, it seems reasonable to me that that legislation should be reviewed on a regular basis. Every 5 years is not an onerous requirement, Madam Speaker. That's generally going to be once per term of a government. That sounds to me to be a reasonable thing. So far, I have not heard any explanation from the government why they feel that they are omniscient enough that any changes they make now are good enough forever and anon and should only be reviewed whenever they feel it should happen to be appropriate, or any future government should happen to feel it is appropriate. I think the people of Alberta are owed better than that. So I am concerned that this government so far, without justification, without providing any reason, is removing that sunset clause. Section 19 adds additional provisions for a peace officer and their involvement in how a person is conveyed after an individual has undergone an assessment. So a peace officer may be involved in the, for lack of a better term, apprehension. I hesitate to use that word, particularly in our current climate as we discuss individuals who may be struggling with their mental health and their interactions with police officers, peace officers, but I believe it's actually the word that's used. But anyways, when that person is picked up by the peace officer and brought for an assessment, I can understand that involvement there. We don't know what condition that person is in. They may be in a state in which it is difficult to calm them down or work with them. We know that peace officers and police officers do receive training in de-escalation, but we also know, and indeed due to the events in the U.S. and the murder of George Floyd recently, I've had cause to go back and review many of the situations under which Black, Brown, and Indigenous individuals have died at the hands of police. And I will tell you, in a large number of those situations, those were individuals who were known to struggle with their mental health, and in many of those instances, it was police were called because that person was having a mental health episode. Now, I don't bring that up to pass any judgment on police. This is a conversation we are having as a society, and I think we are going to be continuing to have, and I hope we have it at a depth and that it leads to steps in action like we have not seen before. But all that just to provide the context here, Madam Speaker. When this bill is now adding in additional involvement of a peace officer after that individual has been assessed. So what this adds in is it says that after an individual has been assessed, a peace officer shall convey the person to the person's home, the location of apprehension, or appropriate accommodations if no admission certificate is issued after the examination, or convey the person to a facility for a further assessment and examination if an admission certificate has been issued. In this situation, if an individual has been assessed and it's been determined that in fact it is appropriate for them to simply go home, could we not consider the possibility that perhaps a mental health professional or a social worker or another individual who has some level of knowledge, experience, and authority who may in fact be known to the individual might be utilized in this situation. Recognizing that in many of these cases we may see a disproportionate involvement of individuals from racialized communities. And as we are currently recognizing and discussing that in many cases those individuals may not have, for whatever reason, a positive association with police officers or by extension peace officers. It seems to me it would be a reasonable consideration that we would, for an individual who has been assessed and determined to in fact be no threat to themselves or to others, that individual could be conveyed back home by someone for them would be less traumatic or maybe less of an issue. And indeed, to allow our peace officers to do the important work that we need them to do. As we see conversations are now even beginning to occur about how we can better utilize other professionals in areas where the police themselves, Madam Speaker, I have heard say they do not want to be the ones to have to deal with those situations because that is not what their job is. So that's another area I would look forward to having more opportunity to discuss, or perhaps hear from the Minister of Health his thoughts on why we are going with just the specific provision there of a peace officer. And if there might not be room, as we saw in another section of the bill, which my colleagues have talked about, where other health professionals are indeed being involved and made part, and we are expanding the opportunities that we're aware of. Indeed, there is the section of the bill that talks about involving nurse practitioners. And indeed, Madam Speaker, in general, I would support that. I think we recognize that within the healthcare system, we have a variety of people with a variety of skills, and indeed that's true also within mental health. And indeed, we recognize that in some cases it is better to have some folks available than others. Having nurse practitioners able to assess, examine, and supervise patients who are receiving community treatment while maintaining physician oversight where necessary, that seems to be a reasonable step. We know that indeed family doctors can be under a lot of pressure. They have a lot of patients, and certainly in the current environment, this government has not done much to sort of help them in relieving their stress, making it easier for them to do their jobs. And indeed, even psychiatrists and others that are involved, and certainly the changes that this government has made have rippled throughout the healthcare system and made it more difficult for many. So allowing nurse practitioners to help out in some of these situations could help relieve some of that stress. So in general, I believe there are some good and positive things. Indeed, as my colleagues have noted, the minister has taken some of the recommendations from the ruling and moved them forward. There are other recommendations which do not seem to have been taken. And so I look forward to further discussion on why that might have been. And as I said, there are perhaps a couple of areas where there could be some adjustments, and perhaps I'll have the opportunity to talk with my colleagues about the opportunity to bring other amendments. But at this point, we are talking about the referral, and that is why I believe this bill should have the opportunity for further discussion by a broad range of stakeholders who could address some of the issues I brought up, and particularly with new awarenesses, like as I've mentioned, around the interactions of racialized individuals, indeed from the Black community, the Indigenous community, and others, and the systemic racism they encounter as parts of these systems, to ensure that as we make these changes, we are not furthering the violence and impact of that systemic racism on these individuals in a vulnerable time and state. With that, I will take my seat and look forward to further debate. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Any members wishing to speak under Standing Order 29-2A? Seeing none. Any other members wishing to speak to Amendment REF1 on Bill 17? Seeing none, I will ask the question. All those in favor of Amendment REF1, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. No. Amendment is defeated. A division has been called. Ring the bells.
on Bill 17. All those in favor of the amendment, please stand.
Ms. Gray, Mr. Shepherd, Ms. Pancholi, Member Loyola, Member Hoffman, Ms. Sigurdsson.
Those opposed, please stand.
Honourable Mr. Copping, the Honourable Mr. Panda, the Honourable Mr. Nixon, the Honourable Minister LaGrange, the Honourable Mr. Glubish, Mr. Godfrey, the Honourable Mr. Nicolaides, the Honourable Ms. Pond, Mr. Ellis, Ms. Goodridge, Ms. Armstrong-Homenuk, the Honourable Mr. Hunter, Mr. Guthrie, Mr. Reid, Mrs. Allard, Mr. Rosewell, Mr. Tour, Mr. Turton, Mr. Williams, Mr. Nixon, Mr. Rain, Mr. Smith, Mr. Getson, Mr. Van Dyken, Mr. Walker.
Total for the amendment 6, total against 25.
Remember that amendment has been defeated. We are now back on the main bill. Are there any members wishing to speak? Seeing none, I will call anyone wishing to close debate? No? Okay. The Honourable Minister of Health has moved second reading of Bill 17, the Mental Health Amendment Act 2020. Does the Assembly agree to the motion for second reading? All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed, please say no. That is carried. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mental Health Amendment Act 2020 is now read a second time.
Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I move that we adjourn the Legislative Assembly until Monday, whatever the date of next Monday is at 1:30 p.m. Monday the 15th. Thank you.
Honourable members, it is 4:30. The House now stands adjourned until 1:30 on Monday.